All right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I have a really special treat. It's actually a show I've been working on organizing for over a year now. Because about a year ago, my two friends here, James Fodor and Nathan Ormond, did a podcast, a 10-hour podcast on the Shroud of Turin. And in response to that, they were kind enough to invite me on to kind of give a right of response, I think is what you guys call it, defending the shroud and that sort of thing. But admittedly, something I respect about our two guests is they were asking technical issues. And I didn't have necessarily the answers in the spot. I'm not a nuclear engineer. So I thought it would be a great idea. Let me actually hook them up with the experts, Bob Rucker and Tom McAvoy, who can actually answer all of their technical questions. So that's going to be the format, the plan for today's show. But just before we get into it, I just want to introduce each of the characters, each of the players. So starting to my left, we have James Fedor. You want to just take a few minutes to introduce the audience as to who you are?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Dale. Yeah, I'm James. I'm from Australia originally, although I'm in the US at the moment. I'm a cognitive scientist and neuroscientist, so I study language and the brain. I finished my PhD earlier this year, and I'm doing a postdoc now at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And my other interests outside of that include like philosophy, history, and like apologetics and religion. So I have with Nathan and my on my own channel a number of videos where we discuss sort of these issues relating to, say, the resurrection or arguments for God, things like that. So yeah, the Shroud of Turin is one issue that has been of interest to me for some time, and it was sort of fun with Nathan to cover that in some depth. And yeah, hopefully we'll be able to discuss some of those issues today.
Awesome. And just out of curiosity, have you always been an atheist on your end, or did you grow up Christian, or yeah, what was sort of
So I was raised as a Mormon, actually. So I left when I was 20. So that was a while ago now. But yeah, I've been an atheist for a while, but I was raised as well, depending on whether you think of Mormons as Christian, but they think of themselves as Christian. So yeah.
Awesome, awesome. All right, cool. Well, great to have you on board. And
Yeah, thanks.
I'll just move immediately to my right, Tom McAvoy. So you've been on the show before, but just for the benefit of Nathan and James, who may not know about you, do you want to just give a brief introduction as to who you are and where you're coming from?
Sure. My name is Tom McAvoy. I am currently Professor Emeritus of Chemical Engineering at the University of Maryland at College Park. Approximately in 2018, I started doing research on the shroud. I'm particularly interested in the ultraviolet photographs and spectroscopy that has been published based on the shroud. And so I actually have published, and I haven't counted now, but 5 or 6 papers on that work. And the other thing I've done, I'll put in a little plug for my book. I've written a book called God the Geometer: How Science Supports Faith. So that's my background.
Awesome, awesome. Well, welcome back to the show there. And we'll go next to the other newbie to the show, Nathan Ormond. Hey, Nathan. Just want to give you some minutes, a couple minutes to introduce yourself as to who you are and where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. You can hear me all right? Sorry, because I changed my mic settings there. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'm Nathan. I'm a software engineer. I've got a background in software engineering in university. I also have a master's degree in philosophy. I'm doing a part-time master's in statistics too, currently. And yeah, I'm very interested in religion and the sort of apologetics and sociology and political sides of religion that James and I comment on in our shows. And in terms of my personal views, I mean, that sort of might be quite difficult for some people to understand where I'm coming from, but philosophically, I'm a pragmatist and like I attend church and read the Bible and consider myself a Christian. Obviously, some people with different theologies will not consider me a Christian, and that's fine. But yeah, so that's where I'm coming from.
Hey, all right. Thank you for that. Yeah, I thought you were an atheist, so I was totally wrong. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So, all right. Last but not least, we have another returning guest, Bob Rucker. So, again, you're no stranger to the show, but just for James and Nathan's sake, do you want to give a brief introduction as to who you are and where you're coming from?
Uh, yes. Graduated from University of Michigan with a bachelor's and master's degrees in nuclear engineering, then spent 38 years in the nuclear industry doing things like nuclear reactor design, etc. And the two things I learned in my experience in nuclear engineering uh, was that,
And sorry to interrupt, Tom. We're getting sort of an echo. So if you just, when you're not speaking, if you just want to mute, and then when you do speak, unmute yourself, just to avoid the echo.
yes.
Sorry, Tom. I'm speaking to Tom
Oh,
McAvoy. Yeah, because we're hearing an echo when Bob speaks.
okay. Oh, I think my phone is off. Let me make sure it is. Yeah, I'll mute mine.
Yeah, just and then unmute yourself whenever you do speak. But yeah, go ahead, Bob. Sorry about that.
Yes, so I spent 38 years in nuclear engineering, learning how to run nuclear analysis, computer calculations, and doing, to some extent, doing statistical analysis of experimental data. And I've applied both of those uh, specialties to analysis on the Shroud of Turin. And so I've been working on the Shroud of Turin for 12 or 13 years now, since leaving the nuclear industry. And my website is shroudresearch.net. I think I have 41 or 42 papers on there right now. Dale, did you distribute my latest paper to people?
Yep, I sent that to them yesterday.
Yes, okay. So that's the late, that'll go on to my website as probably as paper number 44. And so that's a hypothesis to explain image formation and carbon dating on the Shroud of Turin. So I've come up with a concept that explains two mysteries of the Shroud. And this is the only hypothesis that does that, that explains more than one mystery of the Shroud. And so scientists would find that very attractive, I think.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, without further ado, let's get into this show because, like I said, I've been looking forward to it for over a year now. So, I think what we'll do, we'll start, Bob, with you since you're making a positive case here. Do you want to take 10 minutes or less to give kind of your opening? What is your take on things like the carbon 14 and the image formation?
Yes. Do you mind if I bring up some slides here?
Yep, go ahead. I set it up so you should be able to.
Let's see if we can.
Yep. So we're
Okay, so you can see this.
you just
Okay,
need
a
to
little.
maximize which slide. There you go.
Okay. And so, yeah, let me just do it that way, maybe. So anyway, the concept here for the tomb is that it would have a, you see it, the front here. Can you see my mouse or not? No.
I can see your mouse in the sort of bottom left quadrant of the screen
Okay,
in
so
front of
on
me.
the left would be the front, on the right would be the inside. People haven't not seen this type of thing. Most people have not. But there'd be a
And
left bench, a right bench,
do you
and
want
then a back bench.
and Bob, are you wanting this to be full screen for people, the slides, or
I don't know. Would that help?
it would be, yeah, I think it would make it bigger. So if you went to the slideshow and then just clicked on current slide.
Yes, okay, I'm trying to get there.
Right.
I don't know what's wrong with this computer.
Okay, that's fine. This is good enough then.
Okay, so that's what the inside of the shroud looks like. And so that when they brought Jesus in, they they would have laid out half of the burial cloth, put his body down on it. They would have massaged his shoulders before they brought him in. You get his arms through the smallish door. And laid him down, and then they would have reached over and taken the face cloth off the body. The face cloth would have been put on after he died, while still on the cross, to catch the blood that was then dripping out of his nose and his mouth, in order to bury the blood with the body, consistent with Jewish culture. And so then the person up at the front of the pit area, after they bring the body in, lay it on the back of what would end up as the back of the cloth there. They then reach over and take the face cloth off and lay it aside. Would not have laid it on the floor or on the walls or on the ceiling, only on two locations, either on the left bench or the right bench. They wouldn't have put the face cloth on the back bench because the body was there, of course. That becomes important later. So then they would have taken the rest of the long body cloth and wrapped it down over the head and down over the feet. So that the burial cloth, the body cloth of Jesus is 14 feet, I think 6 inches long and about 3 feet 8 inches wide. So the top view is just the unaided eye view. The bottom view here is the photographic negative view, and photography enhances the contrast so that you can see it more easily. So that as we go through and look at the details of what's on the front and the back images, there's two images of a naked crucified man that are on the cloth, and it can be seen, and you can point out the various things here, and it's all exactly consistent with what you see in the gospel accounts in the New Testament. It's absolutely amazing, I think. And so it has long been held that this is the burial cloth of Jesus because of these images, front and dorsal images on the cloth. In general, this is what's believed by most shroud researchers to be the process by which it left Jerusalem, went up to probably Antioch, was maybe taken on different expeditions for various purposes, and then up to Constantinople, either in 540 or 944 AD, and then either by a land route or by a water route up to Lorraine, France, in 1356, brought down, was in a fire in 1532 in Chambéry, France, and then finally arriving in Turin, Italy in 1578. So this is where it's located now. This is the cathedral in Turin, Italy. My wife and I saw this 2 years ago. In the front of this cathedral, front left-hand corner, there's a box, large stainless steel box filled with inert gas, where the shroud is laid out flat in order to avoid further oxidation of it. This is the front left-hand corner of that cathedral. We should also mention the face cloth here is about 33 by 21 inches, low quality linen cloth. Has no image on it, of course, because it was off the body at the instant of the resurrection. And so that the images were made in the resurrection. This is the concept. This was laid aside, so it did not have any image on it, but the pattern of blood and images here have some similarities to what's on the Shroud of Turin. So just in my website, I'll give you an overall view here of my work. My paper number 1 was, going all the way back to the start here in 2016, 2015 and 16, the disappearance of Jesus' body. That was the question. Christians say, based upon what the Bible says, that Jesus' body disappeared from their perception of reality. So part 1 what was the biblical and theological considerations, where I considered the details of Jesus' resurrection in context with the larger theological considerations of the resurrection in the entire Bible. And then paper number 2 was the disappearance of Jesus' body, part 2, physical considerations. If Jesus' body disappeared from human beings' perception of reality, how could that take place? Was the body, the atoms in the body simply transferred into pure energy? Well, of course not. That would have, based upon the weight of the body, 170 to 175 pounds, would have created enough energy to make a nuclear explosion 1,000 times larger than the most significant nuclear explosion that's ever taken place. And so it would have destroyed, of course, the shroud, the tomb, Jerusalem, and most of Israel. And that didn't happen. So, what's the best evidence here? So the best option, and I considered 6 or 7 options for how his body could have disappeared, just from a physics standpoint. And my conclusion was that it's most likely due to that the atoms in his body transferred into an alternate dimensionality. Now, we have five sense perceptions. We can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. And we normally assume that those 5 senses tell us all about reality, but there's no evidence for that. We really don't know that. And for example, when I started my college training at University of Michigan, the big effort in modern physics was to come up with a theory of everything. That is a concept, a theory that explained all the different subatomic particles and their characteristics, their mass, their charge, their spin, everything about them, and how they were all consistent with each other, and the multiple different forces in nature. There's actually 4 forces in nature. 3 of them and all of the particles in nature could be explained with what's called string theory. Only gravity has to be left out of this. But string theory postulates that we live in a reality that's much larger than 3 spatial and 1 time dimension, much larger than 4 dimensions. String theory postulates anywhere between 10 and 26 dimensions, of which our 4 dimensions would only be a small subset. So that, there's plenty of room for God and angels and Satan and demons in these alternate dimensions, for example. We shouldn't have a problem with that. So what I'm saying here is that the most likely option for Jesus' disappearance from within the tomb was that the atoms in his body made a transfer into an alternate dimensionality. Now, dimensionality is a system of alternate dimensions. So we live in a 4 dimensionality, whereas there is anywhere from 10 to 26. So, and I'll point out in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created so that there was a beginning of time, created the heavens. That's everything that's up, all the matter that's up and all the space that's up, and the earth. That's all the matter that's down from where Adam and Eve were existing on the earth. So that indicates that time, space, and matter, according to Genesis 1, all had a beginning. Now, and we didn't realize that until 1968, that space and time also had a beginning. So that Genesis 1:1 far predates this. But that indicates that God is outside of our time, space, and matter, just based upon Genesis 1:1. So just to help people understand what I mean by a transfer into an alternate dimensionality, I include paper number 7 at this point, Mr. Dotman in Lion Land. It's a fictional story. Short, it's only about 2.5 pages long. But I think anyone reading this would find this a kind of a cute little story. Anyway, so I've written 9 papers on image formation and 18 papers on carbon dating, not including my latest one. So my latest one, Hypothesis to Explain the Image Formation and Carbon Dating of the Shroud of Turin, 27 pages, will go on my website as paper number 44. And this postulates that protons form the images and neutrons shifted the carbon date forward. There's been some confusion, I think, where people think that I'm saying that neutrons form the images, but that's not true. It's protons. It has to be charged particles, I believe, that form the images. So that the neutron shifted the carbon date forward primarily by the reaction nitrogen 14 plus neutron produces carbon 14 plus proton. Now, so that in this mechanism, new carbon 14 was produced, and of course, carbon dating is not a direct dating of an item. No, it's merely a measurement of the ratio of carbon 14 to carbon 12. So with the carbon 14 decaying with a half-life of 5,730 years, So what we have here is that the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 after for example, the flax plant is cut down. It's no longer taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from the groundwater, no longer taking in carbon from those sources. And so the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 would simply start to decrease after it was cut down. So that based on that, you might think it would be a very good dating mechanism to date an item. But there are many different ways in which it has been found that this is not necessarily correct. And because the equation that's used to obtain a date from the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio assumes that that ratio is only changed due to decay of the carbon-14. And if that assumption is not correct, then the equation is not valid to calculate a date from the ratio. And so that's what I'm saying is one aspect of this. The equation that's used to calculate the date from the ratio is not correct because new carbon-14 was produced by neutron absorption. Now, I'm listing one of the mechanisms here. There's actually two other mechanisms. There's a neutron absorption in carbon-13 to produce carbon-14. There's also a neutron absorption in oxygen-17, I believe, that emits an alpha particle and produces carbon-14. But this mechanism of nitrogen-14 absorbing a neutron produces about 96.4% of the total. So this is what I included in my nuclear calculations.
All right. So, okay. So, is this just so I know? Are you almost fit? Because I do want to be fair to the other ones and give everyone else their. Are you almost finished, or do you have a lot more left?
I don't. I was trying to go rapidly here. I can stop.
If the other panelists are fine, maybe I can give you an extra couple minutes, and then we can go to the next one. But it's up to the panelists. So, yeah.
Okay.
I don't mind. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so now it's often said that the carbon dating of the shroud to 1260 to 1390 it's science, and therefore that's the range to which the carbon date ought to be understood as being made in that era. And then they often quote a 95% confidence limit on that. Well, the 95% confidence limit simply comes from the fact that this is a 2 standard deviation range that's being used in stating this 1260 to 1390. Now, for example, if they'd only used a 1 standard deviation, then they'd have to quote it as a 67% confidence limit. If they had used 3 standard deviations, then they could state it as a 99% confidence limit. So, but the important thing to realize is that whether it's a 95% confidence limit or not is totally dependent on the average date that was actually obtained from the data before you apply the correction due to the changing carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Now, so that the average date that was actually obtained from the 12 subsamples was 1260 plus or minus 31. That was the actual date that was obtained. So that this range is totally dependent on the accuracy of the 1260 plus or minus 31. If the 1260 plus or minus 31 cannot be trusted, then this 1260 to 1390 range has no validity to it. And that's what I'm saying is the case. This has no validity to it. The dates that were obtained for the 12 subsamples should be rejected. And this is because there are 2 different kinds of measurement errors in any kind of scientific measurement. Now, any scientific measurement will produce 2 values. It produces the value and it produces the uncertainty. And the uncertainty is not something that can just be ignored. It's something that actually tells you what the value means. So they're equally important. We can get into this later. But there's 4 different, to say that this one item proves that the shroud dates to 1260 to 1390 is just not reasonable, because there are three other evidences that this carbon dating indicates. Number two, the date depends on the distance from the short side of the cloth. It shouldn't, because these three samples that were dated were cut from the cloth right next to each other. They should all date the same, but they don't. So that the range here, the rate is about 36 years per centimeter. In other words, it's about 91 years per inch. So if you move it 1 inch, then you change the date by 91 years. If you change it by 10 inches, if you change the location of the carbon date by 10 inches, then you change the date by 910 years. And so that would then date the shroud to the future relative to today. So this is all relative to the amount of new carbon-14 produced on the cloth by neutron absorption. So number three, there's the distribution and range of the dates for the 12 subsamples. That has to be taken into account. And then number four, there's the date of the Sudarium of Oviedo, Jesus' face cloth, of about 700 AD. Now, gee whiz, there's so much that can be said on this. For example, on the Sudarium of Oviedo, there is not an infinite number of locations. There's only one location, and that's what I predicted. My prediction was that the face cloth of Jesus, what's now called the Sudarium of Oviedo, because Sudarium is the Greek word for it. Oviedo, Spain, is where it's now located, and it arrived in Oviedo in the 800s AD, and it was carbon dated to about 700 AD. And I predicted that the person doing the burial would reach over, take this face cloth off of him. Most people are right-handed, so he would have simply laid it on the right bench, about where his body was located, absent-mindedly, because he'd be focused on the body, not on the face cloth. So that's where he would put it. Most likely, that was my prediction. So when I realized that there was this fourth item, I had to go back and redo calculations, my MCNP calculations, where I put the material, the shroud material, linen fabric, on the left bench and on the right bench in order to determine the dates of, on any location on the left bench or the right bench. And so when I finally got those results back, and I looked exactly where I had predicted it, about 15 to 18 inches in front of the back bench on the right bench. And I looked, and that was 700 AD, exactly what it's been dated to. So at that point, I realized I'm doing something right. If I can predict the date for the face cloth correctly, I'm doing something right. Okay, so numbers 1, 2, and 4 were satisfied by my calculations in 2014. It took me until this year to get to number 3, the distribution and range of the dates for the 12 subsamples. So do you want to quit at that point, Dale?
Yeah. Again, if the panelists want more, but I do want to make sure I'm giving each panelist equal time, so to speak. So, yeah, I think probably best to move on, and then we can get into the details. So, yeah, at this point, Tom, I'll bring you in for your opening. Again, you're making the positive case on your research into the carbon-14 dating. Aim for about 10 minutes or less. I'll give you a signal, I guess, both my hands up or something at the 10-minute mark. But if you need a couple extra minutes, as I did with Bob, I'll give each of you guys a couple extra minutes. So,
Okay, now let's see. I click share, but how do I get my PowerPoint up here?
so do you see your PowerPoint on the bottom of your desktop? There's like an
Yeah,
icon, PowerPoint.
yeah. I think the Zoom covered it. Let me see if I can get it here. Let me try that,
Yeah, just click on that. It'll pop up.
and then go to the Zoom.
And then from you want it
we
full
can see it if you want to stay on the slides. We can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And if
can you see that?
Yep,
Yeah.
we're seeing your slide.
Okay. All right. So let me just discuss what I've been doing, and I've been interested since, as I mentioned, 2018-19 in analyzing ultraviolet-induced fluorescence of the Shroud of Turin. And I put a couple of papers here. Those are the two latest that I've written. And what I'm going to talk about is contained in those two papers, last year and this year. And I gave a talk on this out at the St. Louis Shroud Conference in August. And somebody said to me, why would you ever want to work on something like that? And my answer was that there were two reasons. One is the fluorescence results that have been published actually involve data from the shroud itself. And it's hard as anything to get, agreement now to do any more testing on the shroud, which I think is a shame. So this is actual shroud data. And also, I think that what I've been able to show is that there's a good indication that the shroud may have been exposed to radiation. Does what I've done prove conclusively that's the case? No. But I'll let your audience decide. So let's see here. Why don't I just go to the next slide? Or I'd like to actually play this one though.
I think if you go to full screen, like from current slide,
yeah. Okay.
then it would give you the option. No.
All right. Let me go down and go to full screen. This one has some animation in it. Oh, wait a minute. And say play the slideshow, I guess, hey? On the current slide. Okay. And then, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. So with induced fluorescence, what I'm going to talk about are two types. One is photography and the other is spectroscopy. And this is a slide from the photography. And basically, you're doing the same type of thing in both cases. You're taking a UV light source, shining it on something that you're interested in. In this case, it's what you're going to photograph. Or in our case, it was the shroud. And you've got a camera that's going to record what you do. And here is the light spectra. You can see that the UV light has smaller wavelengths and larger frequency and energy than the visible light. And so the UV light is higher energy than visible light. It will actually go into the item that you're photographing and it will come out as visible light. And what it does is it's going to tell you something about the molecular environment of the item that you're photographing. And that could be what? It could be molecular bonds. It could be contamination. In the case of the shroud, it could be burn marks or blood marks. And it's not so simple just to take a picture. What you need are two barrier filters when you take the picture. Now, this shows the UV light shining on the object and the visible light coming out. And so I don't know if my cursor will show up here, but the light goes, you want the light to go into the object, rattle around and interact with the molecular environment and then come out as visible light. You're not going to get an exact fingerprint of what's in there, but you can see, for example, if regions of, in the case of the shroud, are different from one another. And the reason that we need the two filters are the following. With the light source, you don't want any visible light coming in because that would screw up your photography. So you have a visible light filter on your source, and then you don't want the camera to pick up any reflected UV light. You basically want it to go into the object, rattle around, and come out and contain information about the molecular environment. So that's what the ultraviolet induced fluorescence does. Now here's a picture of the shroud, and I'm going to talk about data that Stirp took. So this was back in the late 70s, and they did the fluorescence photography and they did the spectroscopy. In the case of the photography, when they took white light photos, they could take a picture of the whole shroud. They had a big enough illumination. In the case of the UV, they didn't, and they had to take they had a rail system, and they took photos down the rail system, and they would take 8 of them to take the complete shroud, and they could only do half of the shroud at a time. So they did the top half, the bottom half, and the middle. And the red line, the lines here show the pass that Stirp took. Vern Miller was the photographer. So you have the red line at the top of the shroud, the green line down the middle, and you have the blue line down the bottom. And also, obviously, on the shroud, there's a torso. There are 2 torso spots on it. There's a dorsal image and a frontal image. And when you look at the data, this was something that really surprised me. You see some very interesting trends in the fluorescence intensity. A priori, I would have expected something like the blue curve here, that there wouldn't be much of a difference as you move down the shroud. And in particular, if you look at the red and the blue pass that they took, the burn marks there and the blood marks are very symmetrical because of the way the cloth was folded when it was in the fire. And if you look at those traces, you find out that the red curve is always higher than the blue curve. So the top always fluoresces more than the bottom. And I said, that's interesting. Why should something like that happen? The other thing that you see is that when you go down the center, the maximum fluorescence occurs on the dorsal side, right where the torso is. It'd be right here, if you can see the cursor. And then there's a very subtle effect that you have to look at carefully. But the 2 arrows here show where the feet are located on the shroud. This happens to be on the red curve, but it would be true on all of them. The feet are here in the dorsal image, and the feet are here in the frontal image. And if you compare the dorsal and frontal images, you find out that the fluorescence is always higher in the corresponding point on the dorsal image than on the frontal image. And you can go and you can make all of those comparisons. And they're in the papers that I mentioned. So what you find out is the shroud has some very unique, and this would be the fluorescence intensity properties from the photography of it that was done by Stirp. The fluorescence intensity is higher in the midsection of the center dorsal image. That's that green plot. It's higher on the dorsal image than on the frontal image. And that's with all the points that can be compared. And that's kind of an interesting thing. Why should that be? And then and this is, I think, really a strange one. The fluorescence intensity is always higher on the top side of the shroud than on the bottom side. So the question I asked myself, and this was 4 or 5 years ago after getting these results, what could cause these unique fluorescence properties? Now, the fluorescence really is measuring the molecular environment of the shroud. So what we're saying with this is that the molecular environment of the shroud changes with position on the shroud. And what would cause that? Now, as part of Stirp, Gilbert and Gilbert actually did fluorescence spectra measurements on the cloth, as opposed to the images, the photographs. They took up roughly a 1/16 of the cloth. There were 8 down one side, but it was only half of it. So they were about a 1/16 of the size of the shroud. The spectra you can almost think of as point measurements on the shroud. So they're much more focused than the large photographs. Let's see. Whoops, what happened here? They took fluorescence measurements from 16 locations on the shroud, and they were burn locations, blood, clear, and image locations. And they had the data, which was lost, but recreated in 2023 by Schwalbe and Pellicore. And this is a picture of where they actually were taking their measurements with their spectrometer. And this is the data that Schwalbe and Pellicore recreated from the graphs that were in the original paper back in 1980. And the numbers here are just the numbers of the points where they took the measurement. And if you look, you see 4 different types of data here. There's data for clear, data for image areas, and this is again like a point source, data for burns, and data for blood. And the UV intensities here are comparable to change in what I found in the fluorescence photographs when I analyzed them. Now, the interesting thing is, and I guess I've I've kind of lost this to the side, but if you look at it, clearly the burn and the blood marks are going to contain contamination. So you would expect some differences in the fluorescence intensity. But the clear areas and the image areas don't contain any contamination. And so with these areas over here, one can conclude that the molecular structure of the cloth must be different in these different points that they measured. And that agrees with what you see in the UV photos, that the molecular bonds in the shroud vary with position on the cloth. And the question is, what could cause these unique fluorescence properties? Now, in the same article of Nature that the radiocarbon dating was published, Phillips hypothesized that neutron radiation arising from the body covered by the shroud could alter the shroud's radiocarbon dating results to medieval times. And Bob had talked about that earlier. His hypothesis does not account for image formation. It's to do with neutrons, and as Bob said, the neutrons don't form the image.
And
now,
okay,
I got maybe 2 more slides. Now, this is a picture of what Bob had published. It's on his website. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but he made this N particle simulation and published it in 2014. I think it's paper 13 on your site, Bob. And this shows how he modeled the tomb. And these are the results if you take Bob's table and you make a graph down that center line, the green one that I showed you earlier, you get this type of a plot. Now, what's graphed over here is a radiocarbon date versus position along the shroud. And you can see that most of the shroud would date well into the future. One interesting feature that I didn't mention before is that this plot has a double maxima. And lo and behold, and unfortunately our faces are blocking this out, if you plot the green curve that I had up earlier, it looks very similar in shape to this. It has a high peak on the dorsal area and a lower peak on the frontal area. The circle here shows where the radiocarbon dating sample was taken from. So these are Bob's conclusions from his publication. The radiocarbon dating values are higher at the midsection of the center dorsal image. The radiocarbon dating values are higher on the dorsal image than on the frontal image. And they're higher on the top side of the image than on the bottom side. And if you just take and replace each of those with fluorescence intensity, it's exactly the conclusions I got when I looked at the fluorescence intensity results. Okay, and that was from the photography. So I then asked myself another question at that point: could fluorescence intensity be affected by neutron radiation? And I had not really seen anything on that at the time. And so I got 8 samples of modern linen that actually Bob's daughter mailed to me. And I sent them to the UMass Lowell Neutron reactor and had them irradiated with increasing neutron fluence. And then I took UV photos of the samples, and this shows my camera. And what I found was that the average fluorescence intensity of those samples increase with the dose of neutrons, the neutron fluence that they received. So neutrons do indeed affect the fluorescence of linen. So that's one conclusion. Other people have found that other types of radiation, like corona discharge and deep ultraviolet radiation, can affect linen fluorescence. And Fonte has even measured beta radiation from a Shroud blood sample and published the results a little while ago, not too long ago. So one of my conclusions from what I've done is that radiation could well have changed the shroud's fluorescence and molecular bonding, based on what I've seen and based on what other people have published. And this is the question that I would like to see other people, maybe particularly skeptics, answer. How would they explain these results, and are there any other physical phenomena that can affect UV fluorescence of linen and its molecular bonding? So that's basically a synopsis of what I've done.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Tom. I appreciate that. So, yeah, if you stop sharing your screen, we will turn to the other side now, starting with Nathan. Again, I'll give you in 10 minutes or less, give sort of your opening. I'll signal you at the 10-minute mark. If you need some extra time, of course, I'll give that to you just as I did before. So
Just let me, I'm going to try and share. And if it doesn't work, I may have to leave and rejoin for the permissions. Sorry, I'll just be 1 second. And hopefully
yeah,
I'll be able to, though.
yeah, it's
Is,
popping up. It's
you
like
can see it?
all Middle East eye and stuff like that.
Can you, yeah, well, no, that may be the wrong thing.
We're seeing your Facebook and your conversation with James.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, and now you've got that. Now you've got my dog, probably. Um, Stop. I think I shared the wrong desktop. That's frustrating. Here we go. That, you see?
Yep, timeline. Yep.
Yeah, cool. Okay, great. Okay, so I think the first thing to do is to talk about what is the stuff that we are all gonna agree to. Um, I think it would be biased for me to say that this is the first point where it enters history, because those are going to be views that James and I will argue for. But certainly there is well attested history around the Shroud around this point, right? And those come in the form of various sources. There is one physical artifact that appears to show a shroud, which seems to have the same kind of appearance in terms of the herringbone weave, the front and back being displayed, the shield of Geoffrey de Chauny, the guy from the area that we have some other documents attesting the shroud to being in historically. We have some letters back and forth between people about this. So the point that I want to make is there is at least good historical evidence for the shroud existing here, and then that historically we have a good chain of custody from here onwards. I won't go into all the details, um, but basically, there's kind of people donating it to different places. It's being displayed. I think there's an historical source here. What was this one from? An engraving in 1613, which shows it being displayed like this. Um, so, you can imagine. I think the reason that this is an important piece of evidence is because it can also show some of the conditions that it would have been exposed to while people in medieval Europe were, quite into their pilgrimages and going around to see relics and artifacts. And so you can see how it could have got lots of different types of pollen and DNA and things on it as well. And it's being handled, it's not in a sort of pristine box or something kind of squared away. There's also, some a fire quite a long time ago, and then a more recent fire. There's some kind of patch up jobs and things that happened in between. Again, won't go into all the details. And then, as has been discussed, There's also various attempts to investigate the shroud, including this Stirp investigation and a few more recent attempts from people, though obviously most of those attempts have also apart from, well, most of those attempts have depended on samples that were taken by the Stirp research team as well. So to say something that may be contentious, the shroud is sort of relatively historically unattested in the time period before this. Now, there are some things that people will say. I mean, I wrote this on hidden in a wall or something. Trust me, bro, Gary Habermas. Some people in the Eastern Orthodox tradition have tried to argue that it was put in some place in like Greece and then went through like modern Turkey. There's different theories, but there's not very good evidence. So I'll talk about that, but it's basically possible for people to kind of story tell, but the quality of the evidence there just isn't as good as anything. Like, for example, this, where we can clearly see the weave pattern and the coat of arms and letters explicitly referencing it. The artifacts that people describe and discuss are more ambiguous, or the evidence would indicate that there may be something else, maybe like the Shroud of Oviedo or the Sudarium, sorry, of Oviedo that has been referenced previously, or some other artifact. So what I want to go to is to then from here is, so we have this artifact today, right? And we have some data points that we can agree to. And on all that agreed to data, we want to make an inference, right? Which is about what explains this artifact. So we've got this artifact, and I've written drawn to scale, making a little bit of a joke here about the sort of anatomically incorrect size of the hands, which is a detail that I think counts as evidence against it being authentic. But the radiation hypothesis is one that can be modified to account any data, so that that's no problem for it. There's just different pattern of radiation in this region, I guess. So what explains this artifact? We have a question mark going back to our inference, and the point that I want to make about this form of inference is that basically it's possible to tell any consistent story about anything that would produce this artifact. So you could tell a story about a medieval relic creator. You could tell a story about a medieval scammer. You could tell a story about a medieval demon seeking to trick Christians using its radioactive abilities and then you kind of go, you might think that's ridiculous. Demons don't have radioactive abilities. It's like, but you do know that resurrections produce radiation and like God has these powers. I mean, I think that the assumption is either going to be ridiculous in both cases or reasonable in both cases. So, similarly, you could say Jesus resurrected but produced no radiation, right? And then what he did at that point in time is he willed a paintbrush and some modern paints and chemicals, where he meticulously created this image by hand using the brush. He then disappeared those things out of existence, and you could go into all the details of how this would work and produce the type of image that we see on the shroud. And you can tell a consistent story about it. It wouldn't be inconsistent with itself. And similarly, you could tell a story about Jesus resurrected and produced radiation for some reason when he did so in just the pattern that is required to produce the image. And this gets back to some of the things I was talking about, where people talk about the 3D. If you are to try to make 3D inferences from what is a 2D image, and you use this hypothesis, there's some kind of like stretching effect that you have to take into account to try and make it a sort of anatomically appropriate image. So then you have to introduce these sort of inconsistencies, which are quite ad hoc, into the theory about why that's happening in different places. And there's a whole bunch of other things here that are assumptions you will have to make if you want to support this theory. For example, there's some inconsistencies between the shroud and the Sudarium. The type of weave isn't the right type of weave for the area that was manufactured at the time, whereas it is for medieval times. So maybe there was some kind of advanced medieval loom industry in the area at the time for some reason. The type of scourge marks are wrong. There's actually a paper that I'll quickly share actually on this, which is on this paper, The Scourge Marks of Jesus, the Roman Scourge, Historical and Archaeological Evidence. And what she basically talks about is these dumbbell style marks. I don't know if there's going to be a good picture of them on the actual shroud in here, unfortunately. But what it is it's an investigation into the types of devices that were common and we have archaeological evidence for in the Roman Empire for the time period. And the most common types of instruments would not have produced the type of scourge markings that we see, whereas the type of scourge markings that we see are consistent with medieval depictions of the scourge. So, this I would say is quite strong evidence in favor of it being produced by the imagination of the medieval mind, rather than, or alternatively, you could say there was just this really rare scourging event that happened in the Roman period with a device that's very uncommon, but that is a kind of cost to the theory. So to switch back to my other thing, then just before I'll kind of wrap this up. So the point that I want to make is, oh yeah, and then you've also got this stuff about the shroud disappearing for a very long time. But the overall point that I want to make is that I think that what happens with particularly a lot of people who are talking about the shroud and this kind of radiation hypothesis is that they get really into the weeds on the details of that radiation hypothesis. But I think to some degree, these details are irrelevant because there's this additional work that has to be done in attaching that hypothesis, even if it is consistent, to a whole bunch of broader views about like why God would want to do that. What is the probability that God would act in this way as opposed to some other way, right? God, if you think God is omnipotent, can do anything, right? He could resurrect Jesus and not use radiation. He could not produce a shroud. You have to kind of fill in the details of all of these things. And I don't think that this does that. And unfortunately, the type of physical process that is being appealed to is not one that we can ever observe. That's going to be part and parcel of the idea that it's a miracle and it's the action of God. But that is at least rationally going to be a cost for the theory, right? Because there are going to be other things that we can observe that can explain this, and they will get a larger kind of assignment of probability, if you want to think about it like that, in terms of what we should believe here. So, the side of this that I just want to focus on mostly is this form of inference and how it is that it's explained by this hypothesis. How does that fit in with other things we believe about the world? Why would God do this? Why should we think that that is something that happened, even if it is a consistent story? There's all of these things that are consistent stories. Why not believe, a medieval demon did it that sought to play tricks on Christians instead? So I will stop talking there and go back.
Perfect. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Nathan. So, yeah, last but not least, I will turn the floor over to James. For 10 minutes or less, give your sort of opening on the shroud. Again, if you need it, some extra time like Bob and Tom had, I'll give that to you, but I'll signal you at the 10-minute mark.
Sure, no worries. Thanks, Dale. So I'm just going to share a few notes here. I don't have slides, but just document that Nathan and I worked on when we did our previous stream on the Shroud. So Nathan's talked a bit about the history of the Shroud and some general points about how we can explain the Shroud's coming to history and the nature of its image and things like that. I'm going to talk more about specifically the chemical nature of the image and a bit about the carbon dating and link that to the hypothesis that Rob was talking about at the outset. And then maybe that can be a good segue to talk a bit more about some of my concerns or questions about that. So just to set the scene here. So the image on the shroud, sorry, just trying to find the right part of it. I thought I had this open. Yes, here it is. So the image on the shroud is a result of, it's very faint, superficial image, which is caused by yellow discoloration. Let me just zoom in a little bit more there. Yellow discoloration of the cloth fibers. So the shroud is linen, so it's made of essentially plant matter, and the specific nature of the image is this yellow discoloration of just the top like 2 or 3 fibers on the outer threads. And the yellow discoloration only permeates for like a few hundred nanometers. So it's very superficial on the external layer, cell layer of the cellulose. So it's basically what the image consists in is a pattern of what appears to be oxidative damage to the cellulose fibers superficially on certain parts of the shroud, like which taken together forms the visual appearance of an image of a body laying on the shroud. So it's just a bit of chemistry there. We can skip through that. So that's sort of what we need to account for. How did this chemical damage to the cellulose fibers occur, and how did it occur in the specific pattern that it did? Now, one thing we do know is that you can't get this image pattern from just placing a body in direct contact with a cloth. This is an example of two different photographs by Galashelli, who is a researcher who's done, I think, very interesting work on reconstructions of the shroud. These are two images that he produced. On the left was a dry body, and on the right, a damp body in contact with a cloth. And in particular, you see that the face is, you just don't form an image of a face because of the three-dimensional shape of the face. It doesn't flatten out to an image on the cloth very well at all. And you don't get with the dry body, you don't get enough detail in the contours, like the lower contours of the legs and things like that. And then the wet body shows more of that, but it also distorts outwards effectively, again, because you're projecting a three-dimensional surface onto a two-dimensional surface. And so there's always distortions like this. So you don't really get anything like an image that the shroud shows. I'll just show the image of the shroud for comparison there. So this is the front image there. So that's what is seen on the shroud. You can see that's really very different, especially in the face area. There are a variety of different hypotheses about how the image was formed. I don't necessarily want to get too focused on like advocating for one of those. That being said, I think that it's useful at least to highlight where sort of Nathan and I generally think is as a plausible kind of direction. And I really think that Galashelli's done some of the best work there. So a number of scholars over the years have attempted to reproduce parts of the shroud, usually focusing on the face, but some people have also done a full body reconstruction. So a lot of these techniques involve either placing a cloth over an actual body and then doing some kind of rubbing, or actually using a bas relief, so like a carved wooden, somewhat three-dimensional, but like not realistically shaped relief of a face, which you then rub over with, in this case, it was carbon, or in another case, I think they used a pigment. But I think that we know that the actual image on the shroud is not applied. It's not due to a pigment. As I said, it's due to oxidative damage to superficial cellulose fibers. The idea, though, which I think is well illustrated by Galashelli in his work in 2009, what he did is he made a full-scale replica of the shroud. I'm just showing the face here. He placed a linen sheet over a volunteer and rubbed it with an acidic pigment. He then augmented that with a bas relief of just the face. So there's sort of two different sections that he did. He did the face and then the rest of the body, which sort of parenthetically, I think is a good explanation as to why people have noted that the head is disproportionately small relative to the rest of the body. But that's a parenthesis point. So then what he did is he placed the shroud, like the rubbed linen, in an oven to age it up, and then washed it off to remove the pigment. So what he got was this pattern, which is, superficially reasonably similar to what the shroud looks like. And it was, as a result, the image is also formed by the superficial discoloration of the cellulose fibers. So this is an image here, I think, on the left from his, and on the right is the actual shroud. Lighting's a bit different, but they're sort of relatively similar. So again, I don't want to necessarily say this is the exact method. Obviously, we can't know what method might have been used to produce this image. What I'm really highlighting is that a general way that I think about this is that a plausible hypothesis involves a rubbing technique, probably with a separate head and body production, which applies some kind of chemical agent to the cloth, which then causes oxidative damage to superficial oxidative damage to the cellulose fibers in a pattern which broadly resembles an image of the person. So the pigments can then be washed off. They can might have been washed off later. We don't know if that was done by the artist or they wore off over time. the fundamental point that I'm trying to make here is that I think that the best way to understand the nature of the image is through a chemical reaction to the cellulose fibers on the cloth in that pattern. So what I think that on the face of that, it's not really clear that there's anything that needs any sort of supernatural explanation, because what we're talking about is chemistry, essentially. Now, so that's a little bit on the image formation. Oh, and I want to say one other thing about that. So this is something that would be good to talk to Rob about, but just one of my questions regarding the neutron radiation hypothesis is that my understanding of his description of the simulations that he's done to indicate how different parts of the cloth would be differentially aged as a result of the burst of neutron radiation is that assumes that radiation was emitted in all directions isotropically. Yet obviously isotropic radiation wouldn't form an image. You would have to have radiation that in some way preserved a pattern of different parts of the body. And I think it's particularly, again, this would be good to discuss, but I'm just highlighting my concern here. It's particularly difficult for me to see how you would have patterns like this formed by neutron radiation or protons that are produced by the neutron radiation indirectly. For example, one of the things we see here is that there is a clear darkening around the hair. Jesus evidently has long hair here, which is a common medieval trope, although it's thought that in first century Palestine, it's very unlikely that Jews would have had long hair. But again, that's another parenthesis there. But it's sort of unclear because the hair doesn't contain very much mass. So why are we seeing a darkening as a result of hair? But then we see, for example, around the orbits of the eyes, there's relative light patch. And likewise, we see that parts around the hands as well. It doesn't appear that there's any correspondence between where the radiation would be emitted from and where we actually see marks on like the darkening on the sheet. So it's unclear to me how that mechanism is supposed to work. So hopefully that's something we can discuss a bit further later. Now, the second thing I wanted to mention is the radiocarbon dating, because this is the second aspect to the sort of contention here. One is how the image is formed, and the second is dating the cloth. Nathan's already talked about some of the historical aspects here, so I'm just going to talk about the radiocarbon dating. So this was performed in 1988 by taking strips of cloth from a corner of the shroud, shown here. This became a point of controversy because there was arguments about whether that was a later repair site or some other aspect that was different from the cloth as a whole. But the point I want to emphasize here is that there were three separate sections that were taken to date, OZ and A, based on the labs that then they were given to perform the dating. So three separate samples given to three separate labs, and they each performed the dating separately from each other. And in the paper that in which this was published, they also the same labs dated three other samples from artifacts of known provenance and known historical dating. So linen from a mummy from Cleopatra, linen from a medieval Nubian tomb, and threads from a medieval cloak in France that dates to around the same time as the shroud. This dating here, by the way, is a radiocarbon year, so that's date before present, not the actual calendar date there. And what was found essentially is that everything dated to roughly, within a confidence interval within where it was expected to. That is the items of known provenance, and the shroud dated to about 1300 AD or about 700 years old, give or take. Now, one thing that's been noted is that there was a discrepancy between the three different labs with the shroud. You see that to some extent with like the medieval cloak as well, but the discrepancy is somewhat greater. You can see that there's a difference in the age that the shroud was dated to, and this has become a point of contention about why there was this difference in the dates. Now, personally, I don't think that this is interesting, but I don't really think that it is in any way undermines the credibility of the carbon dating. What it does is it increases our confidence interval about exactly how old the shroud is. So we can't, so I'm just going to scroll back up again. We can't say that it's within just the Oxford or within, I think that's the Arizona dating, but the confidence interval should extend to include across the dates there. So we can be less confident as to exactly how old it is, but what the confidence interval is not going to do is extend 1,000 years further backwards to cover the 1st century AD. I don't really understand the logic there, because our confidence intervals widen by 50 years or so, that therefore they should widen by another 1,000 years. That's just not consistent with the evidence we have. In terms of explaining the discrepancy itself, there have been a number of papers that are published on this, but the one that I find quite convincing is this paper which investigated this issue. And I won't go through all the details here, but they hypothesize, well, they don't hypothesize, they established that these labs used slightly different slightly different procedures for cleaning the samples, because all of the labs cleaned the samples to remove any dirt or other accumulated detritus that was on the samples of the shroud. And they used different techniques across the different labs. And what they hypothesize is that even a relatively modest difference in the cleaning procedures can explain the amount of excess material that was removed, which could explain the small discrepancy of about 88 years, I think, between the dates. And this figure here, I think, illustrates this point well, that this notion of there being a linear relationship between the distance from the edge of the sample and the date is a bit simplistic. The carbon date is vertical here, and the distance from the edge is on the x-axis here. This is just based on a crude linear curve fitting, which is not really justified by this approach. You effectively have 3 data points. I mean, there's 4 within each, but they're all done at the same lab, and they're all from, we don't know the exact distances within each. They're all essentially the same distance. I think that you can establish the Oxford as an outlier, and the other 2 are fairly similar. So basically, all we need to do to account for this discrepancy is to say that the Oxford lab used a harsher pre-treatment method, which cleaned off a slightly larger amount of accumulated material, and therefore resulted in a slightly older age than the other 2 labs. And that's I think, the most plausible explanation for the discrepancies in the radiocarbon dating. I don't think that, even if this isn't quite correct and there's something else going on, I don't think it justifies just ignoring the radiocarbon dating, which is a very well-established dating technique, which has been extremely well verified across many different, thousands of studies over the decades. And even in this specific study, correctly identified the dates of 3 other known objects. And so just to finish up, the concern I have about the neutron radiation hypothesis is it's very unclear to me why we would expect there to be any neutron radiation at all, let alone in this specific vertical orientation that is hypothesized. And it is, I think, not really clear that we can, as I mentioned before, draw a link between the emission of neutrons, which allegedly results in the discrepancy of the radiocarbon dating on the one hand, and the emission of neutrons, which in some way triggers proton emission, which then somehow creates an image. That feels like that those 2 things are not well drawn together. At least I feel like I don't really see how those are connected. So hopefully that's something we can talk about further in the discussion. But I think I'll leave my remarks there.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. So yeah, that covers it in terms of all the openings. So now we're going to get to the fun part, the informal dialogue part. And I'm going to trust my guests. I know all of them are respectful and that sort of thing. So try to keep interruptions minimal, and try to be as concise as possible, and just be mindful that, we're sharing the time here. So at this point, why don't we start with the carbon-14? 3 of your presentations dealt with this carbon-14 issue. So, let maybe the skeptics can spark off the conversation on the C14 issue.
Would it be possible for me to just ask one question that should be almost like a yes/no question, really, to start off with, which would just be it's kind of about what's at stake here, and to understand the kind of context. And I would love to understand just whether Thomas and Robert think that believing that the shroud is authentic is essential to being a Christian. Can someone be a Christian and not believe the shroud is authentic?
Bob or Tom, just unmute yourselves. Bob, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Yes, for a Christian, how important is it to believe that the shroud is authentic? It's not important at all. Christians become Christians based upon the historicity of the New Testament documents, not based upon the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is irrelevant in that sense. But when I'm asked about that question by a Christian, why should I even listen to you? Because I have enough faith. I believe the Bible's true. And I say, well, that's fine, but your neighbor needs it. So that I think that the Shroud of Turin is an item that appeals to the present technological age of, 21st century technology. I had to wait 20 years for computers to get fast enough for me to do the work that I've done on the Shroud of Turin. And that's just aspect of it, having to wait. The Shroud of Turin applies to this age, not before.
All right. And Tom, if you want to unmute and answer that.
Yeah, I would agree with Bob that it's not necessary to believe in the Shroud of Turin and be a Christian. I'm a Catholic and I don't believe the church says that. I think it adds to your religion a tremendous amount because of the detail that you see in the shroud, the medical details and other details as to what went on during the crucifixion. So I think Bob and I are pretty much in agreement on that.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, over to you guys to discuss all of your technical questions about the carbon-14 and the neutron irradiation and all that stuff. So yeah, I'll over to you guys.
Nathan, you want to go first?
Well, I already asked the question, so I don't mind, but I suspect your questions may be more specific on that. I mean, broadly, I was wondering, um, is there anything in the theology to suggest why God would want to involve radioactive emissions in a resurrection? You know, like, because if, for example, if you believe God is all powerful, then he could perform a resurrection without radiation, right? So why would God do it this way instead of another way?
So that people would realize that it's true. He left a picture, the first selfie of Jesus at the instant of resurrection. This is the first selfie, and this applies to our current technological age. People can look at it, they can see it. I went with a friend to the University of California at Berkeley. Walked in to the hotel and said, "Hello, I'm here to make a presentation on the Shroud of Turin." And the very tall young man said, "What's that?" So I whipped out my June 1980 edition of National Geographic, folded out the 4 pages of image of the Shroud of Turin, and he looked at it for 2 or 3 seconds and said, "That's Jesus." Now that's what we should all be able to do. It speaks to us. An image speaks to us. And that's sufficient reason theologically for God to create an image of the most important event in human history.
So I think that's an interesting answer. And just to follow up with what Nathan was saying there, because Rob, you said that the image on the shroud is made particularly for us in this technological age, right? As further evidence, right? It's not essential to be a Christian, but it's compelling. Yeah. It's further evidence. And I guess from my point of view, it would seem that if that was God's intention, he would do so in a way which further took advantage of the techniques that we have in this age, and such that it would actually date to when it's supposed to be from, not in using a method which you propose, which has this sort of byproduct that it also distorts the carbon dating. Isn't it a bit odd that God would choose this method?
I actually have felt for a long time that maybe the carbon dating was a blessing in disguise because since that had taken place, there's been an enormous amount of research that's gone on the shroud. And I suspect you would never have as much research as we've had since 1988. The other thing is that it's hard to figure out what God's motives are or his methods are, but maybe he wanted people to discover that he's actually using physics in producing that image, and that could be part of the method. But if you can figure out, what God is doing, that would be great. I don't think we can.
Yes. I think I would respond that you said that the carbon dating is a good reason for not to believe in the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. I think my work has taken that argument, turned it around 180 degrees, so that one of the best arguments in favor of the authenticity of the shroud is the carbon dating. When you take into account all 4 aspects of the carbon dating results, as I've listed.
Yes.
So yes, this again is for our age when we can go into all the details of this, including, my work on this resulted from computer technology and nuclear analysis computer codes. That wasn't available in previous centuries. It's only available now, where I could take the carbon dating and turn it around 180 degrees and make it one of the best arguments for the authenticity of the shroud.
In
Uh,
terms of my question, I think there was sort of something specific that I was trying to drive at that I've not necessarily got from your answers, and I think I can rephrase the question maybe to bring that out. So that would be that, because so we don't want to assume the thing we're trying to prove, right? Because that would be question begging. Like anyone could assume their conclusion. And that what I'm trying to get at with the question is before this evidence, right? Would you agree that your expectation that God would, God's going to perform a resurrection, but your expectation that he's going to produce radiation in this way, as opposed to, say, um, painting something on the shroud, leaving an apple, leaving a stone carving, leaving an indestructible golden ring, like there are all sorts of things that it's logically possible to tell a story about happening that could conceivably act as evidence for someone somewhere, right? So what my question is would you agree that before we have this evidence of the shroud being what it is, that you the probability that you would put, like what you'd be say if you had $10 to bet or something, what you'd be willing to put on this radiation happening would be a very, very small amount.
Yes, I think that's a totally wrong approach to the whole issue. Okay. What I'm doing is that I'm taking the evidence that we have and applying modern forensic science to it and trying to come up with the most reasonable explanation to it. And the most reasonable explanation is that in the process of every atom in his body making a transition into an alternate dimensionality, a very small effect of that 1 neutron in 10 billion that were in his body was emitted. And that had the effect of shifting the carbon date on the cloth. An equal number of protons emitted. It would be deuterium that would be splitting. Each deuterium nuclei that splits would release 1 neutron and 1 proton. So the same number of protons would be emitted. The proton emission would then create the images. And so I don't get into the issue of what I would expect or probabilities. I think that's just the wrong way to do it. You should
I guess
approach this from a perspective of forensic science.
Well, I would agree that we don't have to necessarily assign probability. I'm happy to talk about things sort of abductively and loosely. But what I would offer up as an example here is, so for example, like I've got on my screen, sorry about my dog barking, by the way, he'll stop in a second. I've just rolled these 10 die, right? And it's produced this outcome of the sum of numbers. And I could ask you the question, I could say, well, what explains why that happened, right? Why would you not so even if we don't assign strict probabilities, why would you not conclude that God just performed a miracle in this case, or that, say, a race of gremlins who love the number 34 just caused it with their space technology to be 34? And so I think in your response where you talked about reasonableness, like the reasonableness of the inference, that has to take into account how reasonable something is to put on the table as a hypothesis, not just how it coheres together.
I've already responded to that, I believe.
Yeah, I don't think you can talk about, what's the probability God would have done something or something else. What's the probability that the Big Bang would have occurred? I don't know if you've looked at that, but that is the most amazing physical phenomena, I think, in the history of the universe. And basically, probably greater than 95% of the physicists believe in it. And if you look at it and you look at what could have happened if it wasn't so finely tuned, it's scary. But what's the probability of that? I think I don't think you can talk about the probability of how God would act. What's the probability of quantum mechanics?
But I think
we all
that
know quantum mechanics is the strangest of the physics disciplines.
yeah, I
So
think
how
though
could you assign a probability of that? I think it's just the wrong way, as Bob said.
Would either of you think though, in this case, that this alien race of, like, I think that that's really best explained by this alien race of gremlins who love the number 34. Do either of you think that's reasonable, even though I can tell you a lot of details about how that works?
I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, so do either of you think that that's like, I think that that role of these die is best explained by this alien race of gremlins with future technology. And I'm wondering, do either of you agree that that is reasonable? And I've got a lot of details I can tell you about all of how that works.
I've never considered an alien race of gremlins. So
But why
it
do you
doesn't
think it's
apply.
reasonable? So, but do you think it's reasonable or not that I believe that?
I don't know what you're saying.
Right. Well, I mean, that could be part of a problem as well. So that would be unreasonable, right? If I was just committing myself to gibberish. For example, if I went, I believe blah 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 blah, you wouldn't think that's a sane, rational person.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So would you say that's unreasonable?
Uh, we have to stick to forensic science dealing with the evidence that we have, which is the carbon dating, the dates for the 12 subsamples that were dated, and come up with the best explanation for the range and the distribution of those 12 subsamples that were dated.
I think you can't establish it's the best explanation without answering the questions that I'm asking, though. And I'm seeing those being, quite carefully avoided and not engaged with.
Yeah,
I'm
maybe I
willing
can.
to
Oh, go ahead.
I'm willing to consider any other option than what I've provided.
Well, a natural option would, of course, be that the carbon dating is correct and that the item was produced in the late Middle Ages. But I just want to highlight
No,
a reason.
wait. That's the wrong conclusion. If it were exposed to neutron radiation, the carbon dating could very well be correct, but that doesn't mean it was produced in the Middle Ages.
Well, hang on. So, at what point has it been established that the shroud was uh, subjected to neutron radiation? Because Robert talks about starting with the facts, but that's not a fact. That is a
Well,
hypothesis.
okay, take a look
Yes.
at what I presented with the UV
Yeah,
results.
so that is a fact that there are certain
That's a fact.
UV.
There are two facts, and
Yes.
they both point towards a radiation effect. And I would challenge anybody else to say, well, what else could cause that? That's just one fact. But if you look at all of the facts, the medical facts, the photography facts, I mean, why would anybody create a photographic negative in the Middle Ages before photography was available six,
There's an
seven?
extensive relic industry, wasn't there?
Yeah,
That was
and what are
quite
they going to
lucrative.
do? They're going to sell a relic where you can't see the image
Well,
on the cloth.
Well, it will
you
probably
can
be
see
more
the
about
image on the cloth. I
And
just showed it before.
did
it'll be
they
more about status, I think, and maybe even religious value.
and did they actually then? I mean, the medical doctors have said the cloth involves real blood, and they can see halos forming around the clots and whatnot. So did they go out and get some guy and crucify him, and then
No,
just cloth
no, but
over him? Is that
but
how
there are
they
many
did it?
ways. There's also, if there are many cloths in my house that will have blood on if subjected to forensic analysis, and no one has been crucified in my house. If a cloth is handled outside by many people over 800 or so years, it's going to have.
Yes, and I think we're getting a bit off track here because I was.
Is it going to have the blood exactly where the wounds were, where the scourge marks were?
It's not
Where
surprising
the,
that the artifact would match descriptions in the Gospels if the hypothesis was that someone had based the construction of it on the accounts in the Gospels. That does not seem to differentiate the hypotheses to me. What I was trying to say before is that we need to distinguish between facts, which are things that can be agreed upon and externally verified, and hypotheses. So it's a hypothesis that the shroud was produced in the Middle Ages because we can't observe that. It's likewise a hypothesis that the shroud was the burial cloth of Jesus. We don't know, we can't observe that that's the case. It's another hypothesis that the shroud was subjected to neutron radiation. So these are hypotheses that are attempt to account for the data. Now, it is absolutely essential when assessing the explanatory merit of different hypotheses that we assess the plausibility of the postulates that we're making. And I think that this is another way of getting at what Nathan was saying. Robert before talked about using forensic science, but of course this is essential in forensic science as well as in all types of science. You need to establish not just what is the probability of the evidence given your hypothesis, but what is the prior probability of your hypothesis before or antecedently to your evidence. That's how any statistical approach or any good statistical approach should work. It incorporates the base rate alongside the evidence conditional on the probability conditional on the evidence. So to take an example of the Big Bang, for example, where, well, it's plausibly difficult to say what the probability of the Big Bang is, I think that is sort of a bit ill-phrased, because the real question should be something like, what is the probability, given what we know from physics about the universe existing in an initial dense state and then expanding at certain rates and so forth. And that might be hard to assess, but I think we can actually make assessments like that on the basis of appeals to theoretical physics, which is going to get us outside what we're talking about here. But the other thing that I want to say is Nathan's concern, I think, is that it's very easy to come up with very speculative and elaborate hypotheses that account for any arbitrary set of data. Like we could say, like, the Shroud came from a planet of intelligent gremlins who wanted to confuse us, and because they find that amusing to themselves, right? I could tell a story about that, which is this sort of elaborate hypothesis which could account for all of the data. They even skewed the carbon dating because they think that's funny, right? The problem is that hypothesis is constructed just to account for a specific set of data without any concern for the prior plausibility. Now, one way that you can protect against that is to ensure that the hypothesis makes novel predictions, which is a way of essentially avoiding overfitting, which is a common concern in science. And this is one area where hypotheses like the Big Bang and quantum mechanics excel, because while it might be a bit difficult, I don't think impossible, but difficult to assess like their prior plausibility, you can absolutely establish that these theories have made many novel predictions that were not initially known when they were postulated. And so we can have more confidence that these hypotheses are not just gerrymandered to account for a particular set of data. Now, the concern about the neutron hypothesis is that it is gerrymandered to account for this data. It doesn't seem to have prior plausibility, and it's not clear that it does make novel predictions. So I've said a bunch of things there. I'll let you respond.
Okay, could I just elaborate on the novel predictions?
Yes, because I know that it does make one, which I didn't mention, but feel free to talk about that.
Well, yes. So what I've done is that I modeled a human body inside actually a box shape of linen inside a limestone tomb as it would have been constructed in first century Jerusalem. I then assumed that neutrons were emitted uniformly throughout the body. The computer code then calculated the neutron distributions in the body and everywhere in the tomb within the model, dimensions of the model. And so that then could be used to determine the carbon date that would be predicted at any location in the tomb. And so I wish I could I show once more here?
Yep, absolutely.
Share one more here. I don't know if I can do this or not.
It's set up to let all of you share.
Yes, I know.
And just to clarify, this model that you produced, this is produced after knowing the data that you were trying to explain, though, right?
No.
No. So you didn't know about the Shroud before this?
Well, no, I knew about the Shroud. I knew about the dates. But those dates those dates were not entered into the computer code.
And but what I mean is, you were trying to produce a model that would fit the data, right? And then you're like, wow, it fits the data. It's kind of like not that surprising that would happen to me.
I was trying to produce a model that could calculate the data.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Whatever it turned out to be.
Yeah. Well, not quite, because you already knew what that was, right?
No, the computer code calculated what it wanted to calculate.
Yeah, but that's what I mean is, like, I can take, say, something that I know about, and then I can write, like, I mean, I could probably do it right now. It's just like write a bit of software that will produce those numbers that I already knew. And I shouldn't be surprised by that, because all I've done is actually determine that it produces those numbers by writing code that does that, because I already knew the outcome I wanted to produce. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Okay, what I'm showing here is a reasonable way in which Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson could have cut their samples that they were sent into the subsamples. So we have 3 subsamples for Oxford, 5 for Zurich, and 4 for Tucson. I think Zurich and Tucson also kept back reserved pieces. So I've numbered these 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 across the top, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 across the bottom. And then in the bold black are the measured values for those subsamples. In the red are my MCNP calculated carbon dates. Now, this is based on the assumption that the Shroud of Turin, the correct date, is 33 AD, and that neutrons were emitted homogeneously from the body. And so that I'm also assuming that these 12 subsamples were located in this configuration at kind of the midpoint of the foot, because it's, we're not told exactly where these were located at the instant of Jesus' resurrection. So that at the instant of the resurrection, we have the protons being emitted that form the images, and the neutrons that emitted that spread throughout the tomb, largely reflected back off of the limestone floor, walls, and ceiling to form a distribution.
Why limestone? Sorry.
I'm sorry, what?
Why limestone as opposed to some other stone? Is it because it produces the exact numbers required, or is there independent evidence that we have?
Because that's how it would have been done in first century Jerusalem.
I don't think you know that. I think that that's an assumption that's been baked in to produce the correct numbers. This is the point
I'm assuming that the Jewish archaeologists who tell me that are being honest. Okay, that's my assumption.
Well, they don't know that unless they can produce the exact tomb, right? Which we don't have. We don't. In fact, many historians, the leading hypothesis is that there wasn't a tomb at all.
No.
Yeah, my point is that it's quite clear that is this is one of many assumptions that are being made, and the reason for them being chosen is because they produce the data that you already knew. So then when you kind of act surprised when it produces the data, it's not a prediction, it's harking, it's hypothesizing after your results are known.
Okay, so what you want me to do then is to run this with some other material other than limestone.
Well, no, it should at least be an epistemic prediction. So if you had a model, right, which produced these predictions, and then we independently started discovering this evidence, that would be surprising, right? Because you wouldn't have known about that beforehand. But the problem is that you knew about all of this and then produced the model afterwards. So it's just not surprising it all fits together.
Yes, limestone is a very common material in Jerusalem. If they're going to cut any tomb into any material, they would do it in limestone. It's not an issue.
And sorry, James, I saw you trying to get in there. So
yeah, well, I mean, limestone's certainly easier to cut than some other rocks. But I wanted to ask Robert how, because I think the issue here is that Nathan's getting at is what we might phrase as sensitivity analysis. So how sensitive are the results you get to different assumptions you had to make? And one of them, as an example, is the type of rock. But there are others as well. And one that I particularly want to ask about is how do you know how much neutron radiation was emitted per mass of body? Like, where do you get that parameter from?
Okay. Under the concept that I'm using here, that neutrons were homogeneously emitted from the body, that shifted the carbon date at the upper corner of the shroud, depending on how you hold it. If you're holding it horizontal, it would be the upper left corner. If the front image is to the left, be the upper left corner. And you would, you're then assuming that was then located relative to the body at the instant of the resurrection. Mm-hmm. You can then calculate the neutron distribution in the tomb, and it really doesn't matter too much what material you assume.
Yeah, I'm not asking about the material. I'm asking how do you know what the dosage, the amount of neutrons per mass of body, how do you know what that was?
Yes. So there has to be a certain number of neutrons emitted from the body in order to shift the carbon date from 33 AD to 1260 AD.
Yeah. So it sounds like you calibrated the dosage of neutrons emitted to produce that shift. Is that correct?
Exactly right. And that's
right.
common.
So that's not making
practice.
A novel prediction. That's just accounting for the data that you already have,
yes,
which is fine, but it's not a novel prediction.
No, I take no credit for the fact.
Okay.
I take no credit for the fact that my results produce an average date of 1260 because I'm normalizing the data to obtain these results. I fully admit that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. But what I am taking account for is the distribution of the 12 subsamples that are measured. And so what I'm showing here is the bold, black bold are the measured values, and the red bold are the MCNP calculated values. And so what I'm saying here is that, yes, both the measured values and the calculated values, my MCNP values, are both normalized to 1260.17. Because that's what the measured values, if you take the measured values and you simply do a simple averaging of all of them, it's 1260.17. So I normalized both of these to 1260.17 in order to make them comparable. And that's reasonable and appropriate to do. So I don't take a credit for that. But what I am taking credit for is, in this case, is the arrangement or the similarity of my calculated values to the measured values.
Can I just ask a follow-up about that? Because my understanding is, so each of the three labs cut their sample into substrips. And this slide that you're showing us here is based on a reconstruction of those substrips, because my understanding is we don't know how they were cut up.
We were never told.
Yeah, so how do you identify which particular substrip corresponds to, because we have the dates for the individuals, but we don't know where the substrips lay in relation to each other. So how do you assign those?
Yes. Now there's various types of information that's available. Zurich, the different areas, subsamples of Zurich, there are pictures of this after they were cut. And so I have to redo that. This is the results of first iteration, I would say, and I think I have multiple different iterations to go on this. But part of this aspect is trying to take the information we have. Now, for example, on Oxford 1, that's designated as O for Oxford 1.2b. Now, below that, we have 6, what I'm calling subsample 6. That's O for Oxford, 1.1U. Okay, whereas above that's 1.2. So in other words, I think we have to have a horizontal line, or we have to have one subsample for Oxford being larger than the other two, because the other two are 1.1U and 1.1B. So you have to take into account their own designations, first of all, as to how these were cut. So in other words, the first cut was made that separated 1.1 and 1.2.
So
okay?
I just want to, just for the audience, just to clarify what's going on here. You guys, Nathan and James are kind of saying, what are inputs for your model, your hypothesis? And you're saying, yes, the average dates, that 1260 to 1390, or I think you put it 1260.1, that these are an input into the model when you do the calculations. Also, the range of dates, and I guess the average dates of the 12 subsamples. But what you're saying is prediction is the arrangement
Yes.
that you're finding.
Maybe I could clarify. I think there's another. In order to produce these dates from your model, right? You've produced a causal process and assumptions about how that's all working, and you're modeling what carbon dates that would produce subjected to this kind of test, right? Is that incorrect?
Could you repeat that?
So like what you're presenting, like your values that are produced here, they're a model of what would happen if a certain set of assumptions were true that are a part of a process that you're stipulating, right? So that is that that contains elements like that there is a certain type of radiation that's produced, that type of radiation corresponds to mass and density of the body that's being resurrected, maybe some assumptions about the material and things as well. And that, I mean, is that all correct, or is there anything in that that you would kind of disagree with?
Yeah, yeah, yes. And how I've divided these into the subsamples. This is just my first iteration, and this is part of the input, and I acknowledge that. And so one aspect of devising how I've separated these subsamples is between, for example, 1.1 and 1.2. So the first cut that was made separated 1.1 and 1.2. Same thing over in Zurich. The first cut would separate 1.1 from 1.2, etc. Okay, as best you can. And then I took the carbon dates that were measured, okay, and I arranged them in the pattern that I believed would turn out best. This is an optimization process that's often done in forensic science. Okay, if you're talking about forensic science applied to how the solar system came to the arrangement that it has, or whether you're talking about the Big Bang cosmology, arranging the galaxies as we see them in the universe. There's still an optimization process.
Yeah, lots of sciences do this sort of thing. It's like I just like what I'm interested in is just like the specifics and not how similar, like not sort of like saying like really this is like good science, like because that isn't going to persuade me. But what I'm interested in terms of the details in this case is, so how would these numbers vary if the mass and size of the body varied? That is assumed in the model.
Wouldn't vary at all.
No, so there isn't an assumption that the body is producing radiation. What is the what even is the process then?
I'm assuming that neutrons are emitted homogeneously from the body.
Right, but what's the body here? That's the question I'm asking, right? Because the body has a spatial dimensions to it.
It's a human body, right, about 175 pounds, 5'10".
And if that, but what I mean is, so like, how much variation in the size of that body can we have? Because that you've agreed that that does determine the number that's produced, right? So by how much?
Well, let me back up.
Will it answer the question if you back up?
It really doesn't. No.
Okay.
So what I did
so it's
was
not a factor of the mass. So the process isn't that the body is producing radiation.
The body is releasing radiation, yes.
Okay. So we need to know the size of the body, right?
I'm assuming that neutrons are emitted homogeneously from the body.
Okay. And if the body is 1 inch longer than you assume, how much does that change things?
Well, in the bottom line, nothing.
How do you know that? Like, give me numbers.
Okay.
Well, so he adjusts the rate of emission based on the carbon dating. So he could like adjust that parameter, is what I understand.
Okay.
Well, that's what I'm saying though, and I want to point out that when you are making these adjustments, these assumptions are completely ad hoc, and I think that in the numbers it will come out just how recherché that is when you see the amount of variation in each of these variables. Like it's obvious that you've produced this model just to match the numbers and then gone, wow, it produced the numbers. And it's not surprising at all. And then you dodge around the question and start saying, this is what physicists do.
I'm not
This is what quantum physicists do. I don't care what quantum. Yeah, sure. I don't think quantum physics is that amazing, actually, personally. So I don't like. It's not going to convince me. Like,
if you stop talking and let me talk.
Well, I know the feeling.
Stop talking. Okay, just stop talking. The question was, how many neutrons are emitted from the body, and where did I get that number? I derived that number. Let me back up a little bit. What the MCNP code produces is that it produces a distribution of a neutron distribution, neutrons per square centimeter per second, in every location within
I
the
mean,
model.
we obviously know this because of the question we're asking. So, like, why not just answer the question?
I'm trying to.
But why not get to that answer? Because we know the thing. We know you have a distribution, right? We had to know that to ask the question we've asked. So it seems like you're
So,
kind of trying to buy time because you don't either. Maybe you've not thought about this. That would be fine. Or maybe you don't
no,
have an answer and you're trying to just like like look over there kind of thing. Or
okay, let me just give you the answer and let you play with it as you want. The
okay.
answer is 2 times 10 to the 13th neutrons were emitted from the body.
Right, but what body? Like you're still not giving the relevant details, right? What per
So is
area
it
of
is
the
it per
body?
unit mass or volume is one question that I had
Just from the body.
from the bot. But like,
What body?
so
The body that I modeled in my MCNP computer code.
And why that body as opposed to the actual infinity of other bodies that you could have chosen in your model?
I chose the model to
Fit the data.
yes, I chose the
yeah,
data based upon
based
the
on the data.
Shroud of Turin. So I'm trying to determine what can explain the
Well, no, I
measured
know. No, I
dates
know.
for the
Well,
12 subsamples
the Shroud of Turin
that
isn't a
were
body,
actually
though.
measured.
The Shroud of
Yes.
Turin is the image, and like you're still making an inference. You're not just one to one taking the exact size of the Shroud of Turin, because then you would just get a flat. It's a 2D image, right? So you would just get a completely
Well,
flat
that's what I
production.
was wanting to ask about. So, what assumption does the simulation make in terms of the size and shape of the body? Is it modeled as a cube, as a sphere? I presume you have a
No,
shape.
yes, I use about 7 or 8 different cuboids or cut pyramids
Right.
to measure the body. Now, let's see if I can.
If you could show
So
that, that would
what?
be.
Yeah, if you finish up,
Okay,
I
so
do.
this is a side view of the model. You can see in the gray is the limestone. You can see the rolling stone in the front. You can see the opening here. Underneath, to the back and to the top is 1 meter of limestone bench here, the body laying here. So that the model here,
I see.
again,
I
one,
see.
1 meter of limestone around it. We have the body laying here. And if we were to zoom in, you can, the head is too small here. It's not wide enough in my initial calculations, I think. But you can see the cut pyramids here I'm using for the legs and for
Yeah.
the feet, because that's where it gets important. The arms I've molded into the abdomen. So the arms are not modeled separately. Because I was in nuclear engineering for 38 years running these things. I have a good feel for things as to what's going to be important and what's not going to be important.
How
So that
many resurrections did you use in nuclear engineering?
it's not relevant.
Well, it is if that's the domain of expertise, right?
I don't see
So
why
you're appealing to your expertise as a relevant detail for your ability
yes,
to make
yes,
inferences
yes.
about resurrection events. So I would like to know
No,
how common that
no,
was for you to do
no.
as a nuclear engineer.
This isn't. This model is.
It's irrelevant, right? So you
I'm
shouldn't
not
have.
modeling a resurrection
But
event
but
in
why
the
not
model.
just say? So why not just say my expertise is actually irrelevant to the argument? Let's just focus on the argument.
No, you're asking why not run a body with 1 inch longer on the feet,
Well,
or
I'm saying why use
10 times
rhetorical
heavier,
devices in order to try to persuade rather
or
than
why
just
why not
focusing on
use
the
a
details.
different material? These things really are not going to be important. Once you realize that the bottom answer is that about 2 times 10 to the 13th neutrons are going to be emitted from the body. Now that's from the entire body.
But if you vary
That
that,
we
how much does it change the image produced? Like that, these are the details that are really
Well,
important to the question.
that's
I
what I
think
wanted to ask about. I mentioned this before about the image production, because one thing I don't understand is if neutrons are the neutrons emitted isotropically? Is that the hypothesis?
it really doesn't matter too much.
Well, it does for image formation, surely, because how can isotropic neutrons produce the image? They have to be
Neutron,
differential based on the pattern that we see on the shroud.
yes. Did you receive the latest paper that I?
I had a quick look at that. I didn't have time to read it in detail, but
Yes.
maybe
Well,
you could clarify how I know you say protons form the image, not the neutrons directly, but maybe you could clarify that because I didn't quite follow.
Yes, when a deuterium nuclei splits, the proton and the neutron are emitted separately. They actually go in opposite directions due to conservation of momentum.
Yeah.
So if the proton goes up, then the neutron goes down, and vice versa. Okay, so that the neutrons are never changed into protons. These are totally separate particles. So the neutrons accomplish one function. They shift the carbon date. The protons accomplish one function. They form the image. The neutrons did not form the image. I hope that's finally clear.
If the neutrons are emitted isotropically, the protons must also be emitted isotropically because they always go in opposite directions, as you just said.
Yes.
So how do isotropically emitted protons form an image?
So what I said was that it's not really important whether the neutrons are emitted isotropically or vertically, because it's not too important, because there's significant amount of neutron scattering within the body. So that neutrons are scattered off of hydrogen. And when they do that, they lose all of their information content as to how they started. So that whether a neutron is emitted homogeneously or isotropically, I mean, whether it's emitted vertically or isotropically is not too important. Now, it does become important when you're talking about image formation. And how in the world do you get deuterium nuclei to split? Is it from another particle hitting it? Well, yes, but I don't think that's the basic cause. I think the basic cause is a very high frequency, powerful vertical oscillation of the nuclei in the body. Such high frequency, so powerful that the neutron and the proton in the deuterium nuclei split.
Okay, and we'll get to the image formation. Right now, I do want to focus on the carbon-14.
Yeah, but we were supposed to be talking about that.
Yeah, I just want to because James mentioned something about Tom's research, and this is something that can be seen as confirming. This is definitely independent of Bob's work. So, like James and Tom, did you guys want to go back and forth on Tom's confirmation research as well?
Can I just make a point? You were asking for a hypothesis or a prediction that Bob would make, and we know that neutron radiation affects fluorescence. Okay, I've done the experiments on that. So one prediction from Bob's code would be that if the shroud was exposed to neutron radiation, you would see a difference in its fluorescence properties in different locations on the shroud. And in fact, I put up 3 of the hypotheses that you could make: that the top would fluoresce more than the bottom, that the highest fluorescence would be down the center line, and in particular in the dorsal region, and that the whole dorsal region would fluoresce more than the frontal region. So those are 3 predictions that actually agree exactly with what his simulation produces.
So just a question about that then. So here you're using mass, right? In order to as the predictor, right? So the reason that the Y value is the highest at that point, around 40, whatever it is, at 40 on the x-axis, is because that's the mass in the body. That's the causal process behind that graph, right? The hypothesis.
This is Bob's slide.
Did you get the questions? Okay, sorry, this is a different thing. This isn't to do with fluorescence. This is carbon-14 date, that one.
Right.
Well, they're supposed to be connected as the hypothesis, because the idea is that the distribution of neutrons is related to the mass of the body, which in turn, the distribution of the neutron emission gives rise to the difference in fluorescence.
I'd assumed it was fluorescence on the graph because I didn't read what was on the y-axis there, though. But yeah,
it was radiocarbon date.
So what hypotheses would that fluorescence differentiate between? So what else can and can't produce fluorescence like that?
Well, other kinds of radiation can produce fluorescence. In Bob's case, he had that plot where he shows that the those three properties, the fluorescence is maximum in the dorsal region, center dorsal region. The dorsal region fluoresces more. He actually has radiocarbon dates to a later date than the frontal region. And the top of the shroud would also date to a time that was later than where the bottom side of the shroud would date. And that's exactly what a simulation shows and exactly what the fluorescent spectra show that I measured, not the spectra, but the photographs.
And if Jesus was 2 kilograms lighter than in the assumption, what would happen?
To what?
To the assumption that's made for the model.
I think there are so few atoms that are going to split in his model that it wouldn't make any difference. He's talking about a tiny fraction of the atoms in the body. The other thing is, it's not the only explanation that you can get. Giulio Fanti is proposing corona discharge in order to get the image. And as part of that, you would have neutron radiation. So there's more than one theory for how that might happen.
Why not assume God just produced the image?
I'm sorry?
Radiation? Why not assume that God just produced the image?
I suppose you could. I mean, but if you can explain it, I think that's even better.
But why would it be better if it includes making all of these assumptions, right? That we don't have any independent reason to think about Jesus's mass and size and things. And the directionality, the intensity in different places varying.
Now you're talking about what Bob did.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think you both believe it. I mean, anyone can answer it, but
Yeah, if the body was 170 pounds, some estimates based upon the image on the shroud indicate that it's 170 pounds. Other estimates, 175 pounds. What if I ran a 170-pound body and a 175-pound body in my computer calculations, and I wanted to know how many neutrons had to be emitted from that body to shift the carbon date at the sample location from 33 AD up to 1260 AD? The answer in both cases would be 2 times 10 to the 23rd. Okay, so
what if there were differences though in the intensities in different regions of the body? Like why do we know that? How do we know the relationship between the mass and the intensity of the emission? I mean, I know you've assumed uniformity, but why?
I'm doing this at this level of complexity at this point for simplicity and to allow the computer code to operate more rapidly.
If I could produce the same with an elephant and 5 parameters, would you then think that an elephant produced the image? If I could do the exact same thing as you, if I gave you a computer program that assumed an elephant, and we know elephants existed at the time, and that the Roman Empire moved them around, more so than we know resurrections actually. So we'd have a higher kind of plausibility of prior.
Okay.
And if I could modify, say, 5 parameters and produce this image with this process, would you believe an elephant, a radioactive elephant, was there?
Okay, so when we're talking about image formation, we're not talking about my MCNP calculations, because these calculations are not related to the image formation. The image formation is separate consideration.
So this isn't the process that formed the image.
No, it's not. This is what shifted the carbon date. You have to get that clear.
So you need to make another assumption about a different causal process that's involved there, or are they related causal process where the image? Are they dependent or independent?
Did you get a copy of my latest paper?
I've not had time to read them though.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. So what I did in order to derive my image formation hypothesis, first thing I did was that just by thinking about it and putting together 12 years of research on the shroud, I listed 27 different evidences related to the image. The image is
But
on the cloth.
if there were two independent processes, would you agree that that would be a weaker hypothesis than a theory that had one process?
Well, yeah. See, I'm often trying to deal with what you're thinking in the background.
I'm
Okay.
thinking that one, it's better if I have one unifying explanation that can explain two pieces of data, that has a higher prior probability than in a hypothesis that forces me to make two assumptions.
Two assumptions. Yeah. Yeah. So a hypothesis is a proposal that could be true. It's not
Yeah,
saying it is true.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That's how I've been
A
using it.
hypothesis is a proposal that I'm claiming could be true because it
Yeah.
agrees with the evidence.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's how I've
So
been. And would you agree that a hypothesis that makes two assumptions is a hypothesis that makes two assumptions is one that we shouldn't believe over a hypothesis that makes one assumption if they both explain the same data?
well, it depends on the nature of the assumptions.
Well, if they're independent, they're does it? I
Okay.
mean, I guess in both cases, let's just assume for the sake of argument that all of the assumptions are a part of our background beliefs already.
Yeah, yeah. So that, for example, on my MC&P calculations, one question was, what predictions does it make? So
So do
when
you
I
think the questions are legitimate or something? I'm just not getting it. Like my answer, right, would be if all of these things are part of our background knowledge, they're all on an equal footing. One hypothesis makes two assumptions, one makes one assumption, and they both explain the data equally. I would go with the single assumption. If you wouldn't do that, why? Is it because you reject the question? You need some additional piece of information? What I don't get how you're thinking about it.
well, if there's two assumptions which are both 99% probable in one hypothesis, but another hypothesis makes an assumption that's 10% probable.
Yeah, they're all equal. I specified that. Or every
Oh,
single
they're
assumption.
all equal. Okay, well then yeah, I go with the one with the least assumptions.
Rob, we talked about this before, and you rejected this notion of assessing a prior plausibility or probability to different hypotheses. Like when we asked how plausible is it to assume that God would emit the neutron radiation in this way, you said, well, we can't assess that. You're just trying to match the data. But now you're saying we do need to assess that.
No, no. What I said was that I don't go there because I don't need to when I'm doing forensic science, and that's all I'm doing.
Well, I think you do need to go there when you do forensic science. Like that's what they have to do. For example, when they're doing genetic matching tests, they have to assess what's the probability that the sample would match the evidence found at the crime just randomly from the population. That's the base rate. And then what's the probability that we would expect to see this like conditional on it being a match? Like you have to assess both criteria. And I think the problem with the problem with just stating that there's this neutron radiation that's emitted in a certain way is that there doesn't seem to be any reason to postulate this apart from just to account for the carbon-14 dating. And at least to me, it just seems really implausible that God would have this radiation emitted purely for the purpose of skewing the carbon-14 dating if it doesn't even produce the image. Like I don't really see how you can get around this, that it seems really ad hoc and contrived to postulate this solely so that God could skew a carbon-14 date. Why would he do that?
Tom wants to speak. So
Yeah, can I give an answer to that? There are other theories that involve one hypothesis, and that's Giulio Fante's corona discharge theory. So if you look at that, he's only saying it was a corona discharge, which was accompanied by the neutron radiation. Now, in Bob's case, I think he's only making one hypothesis, and that is that the deuterium splits, the proton goes north-south. And,
well, he clearly said that doesn't account for the image formation. That's what I wanted to clarify.
The proton does. The proton does.
That's how
but not if it's emitted isotropically. Or that's what I was trying to clarify. Maybe we could clarify that when he comes back. But
because that's what I was also kind of getting at in making inferences between like reasoning about this model, right? And the assumptions that we're making about mass and how they
But
affect
he
and
just
vary
said that.
things.
He said there's one process that changes the carbon date, and there's another process that forms the image. Like he just said that like 5 minutes ago. So there's
Well,
clearly two different things going on.
maybe he meant
But
there's two processes, but it's one process
I'm
behind
not
them.
sure.
they're related to one another. The other thing is I mentioned, Fonte's corona discharge, and that's a single process that he's proposing. He also, and that's involved with having an electromagnetic field that would have existed in the tomb. And he's talked about the holy fire in Jerusalem that occurs every year, and they've measured
Uh,
electromagnetic effects in Jerusalem. So,
in the at the time or now you're talking about, sorry.
say it again.
You're talking about the measurements taken now of electromagnetic effects and
Yeah,
inferring whether
they
they
were
were
taken in
accurate.
something like 2014. They actually took measurements there, and
It might be
uh,
a bit of a rabbit hole. So would you agree that the kind of hypothesis James offered is empirically adequate for the data that we have? Like,
uh,
what's the problem that you see with the method that James described, which was produced in the lab?
I'm not sure what he described.
Galashelli.
Oh, yeah, okay. That's the image. I think if you look at that image, yes, you can get the image, but there's just all kinds of other things on there. Medical doctors have looked at the shroud and the wounds, the fact that the blood has serum halos around it, where the wounds occurred. You've got
Yeah, but I mean, if you look at Robert's Jesus, he was a square, right? It's better than a square.
and I think what you can do is you might be able to match some aspects of the image, but all of the aspects of the shroud, you nobody has explained that yet.
Well, maybe we could take
Satisfactorily.
one thing at a time because just throwing five things out is a bit hard to assess. So, what is the difficulty in having blood on the shroud? Blood is not hard to find.
Because the blood would have to come from somebody that was just crucified. It would
How
have
do
to
you know
come
that
out.
it would?
Why?
How can you distinguish blood from someone who's been crucified from someone
Well,
who has not been
if you
crucified?
look at some of the papers that have published, the doctors are able to do that.
How
No,
do they do
we
that?
have looked
How
at
does a
them. Yeah.
contemporary doctor know what crucified blood looks like for a start? And how can you distinguish that on a
They
centuries-old shroud?
they know what blood is like after the person has died
Not
and
in
it's
the
been.
Has
papers.
died, yeah, maybe, but crucified? How do you know
It,
that they've been crucified?
in the
Uh,
papers we've read, we've not come across any of
Yes, I
that.
didn't find this either, so I'm not sure what you're
I've come
referring
across
to.
people identifying heme groups and things like that, and potentially and some like genetic evidence, of human genetic material. But
There's
again,
heaps of genetic material on the shroud from all over the place.
yeah.
So I
yeah,
don't
I
really find that very
think
convincing.
I don't find it convincing if somebody can just match the image on the
Why
shroud and
not?
not all of the other aspects of it, the medical aspects and
What medical
the
aspects?
pollen aspect.
Could we focus on one at a time,
Well, I
please?
took the I mentioned the blood and its condition and what it looks like. William West has put out 3 books, one of which is excellent in terms of describing all of those
So you
medical
won't talk
issues.
about individual pieces of evidence.
Um, I don't know. What do you want to talk about?
Well, I emphasized the blood, and I was asking how is it that a doctor can distinguish between crucified blood and not crucified blood? I didn't think I got a clear answer on that,
Would,
and I've not come across that in my research, how
would you
that can be
agree?
distinguished.
Would you agree, though, Thomas, it's important to have an answer to that question to rationally make this argument that there is a difference between the hypotheses?
Yeah, I think you can look at what must have happened during the crucifixion and how Christ died, and what must have been the condition that he died in. I mean, that the
Oh,
doctors today can
sure.
certainly
But if
assess. And if you get somebody that has been dealing with that, I think they can
Well,
certainly
no
make
one's
that
been dealing with
assessment.
crucifixion in the
No, but
contemporary
with
world.
dying people, they certainly
Oh
have,
yeah,
and
I mean,
people that have been
maybe so.
tortured
So
and
is the
wounded.
claim that the blood on the shroud matches a dying person or a crucified person?
Probably a dying person
Right.
because they
So
haven't
does
been.
that contradict with the hypothesis that I raised, which was that the shroud manufacturer in the Middle Ages used a technique analogous to Galashelli's and then applied blood from a recently deceased person?
I think if you try to do that, you're not going to be able to do it. The blood would
Why
clot,
not?
and it wouldn't have the same
Well, if it's
conditions
very
that the
recent,
blood.
it wouldn't.
Well,
But any
let's not
blood clots,
interrupt,
why
right?
is that differentiated from a crucified victim? I mean, but by the time the shroud was placed on Jesus, it was several hours after he died. So clotting happens quite quickly. So what's the distinction here?
And people have talked about why the blood would have stayed liquid and it could have been stuck to the shroud, and then how did he get out of the shroud without disturbing the blood?
So I don't see how that answers my question.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you're asking.
I'm asking, how do we distinguish between my hypothesis about the formation of the image, which involves applying blood from another source, versus the hypothesis that the blood on the shroud is actually from Jesus?
Because if somebody could do that, there was something like I don't know, a $2 million prize offered a couple of years ago if somebody could reproduce everything that's on the shroud, and nobody took the prize. I think you've got
I've never
not
even
just
heard of that.
you not well, it was in Britain. You've not
Hmm.
just got one condition that you're going to have to meet. You've got a whole slew of them.
So the reason why we can differentiate the blood hypothesis is because we have to meet other conditions. I don't understand how that answers the question. Maybe we could talk about a different piece of evidence.
I'll give you $3 million if you can reproduce a shroud with a resurrection.
Well, yes, obviously that's
Yeah,
by
but
nature
and you
a
but
one-off.
but no one's taken the prize, so so that's good evidence, right? I think that's going to cut both ways. Like I don't think that provides us a good reason that we should.
Well, we don't know the exact method used to produce the shroud. I actually, this is a point in general that it's almost impossible to produce the exact any exact historical artifact, because you're going to need the time and place in which it was produced to result to like reproduce all details. So I think that that's actually an unreasonable criterion, that we can't establish where an artifact came from unless we can reproduce all details that can be gathered from any type of investigation of it. It just needs to be a plausible enough given the context, in my opinion.
And I think that's an issue though for the prize as well, right? Because when they say that matches, that is underspecified. Matches in what regard? Does it have to be millimeter precise? If there's millimeter deviation, is it different? If there's one shade off in one place,
I suspect that no historical artifact would ever be duplicated if this were the criterion. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you would assess that, but that would be my concern. But anyway, yeah, sorry. I don't know that this is very productive. Maybe Dale, you can direct us somewhere else.
Yeah, because
Let me get back to one point that came up earlier, and then we got way off on what Bob was talking about.
Sorry.
Well, just
And
before
that
we
was
move on,
the radiocarbon dating, and you mentioned Swalby and Waltz's paper. And one of the points that they made in that paper, which you didn't mention, is that for those data from the three labs to be combined, they had to be homogeneous. That's a clear conclusion from their paper. And the Arizona data definitely was not homogeneous. So those three laboratory sets of data should never have been combined.
So that doesn't make sense to me. I don't think that's
well, maybe
great.
could you
Go
unpack
ahead.
your terms? When you say,
can I finish? There's a
Yeah,
statistical test that says if you've got data results from three different laboratories, what's the condition that you can combine them and draw conclusions about the answer you're looking for?
But there's a reason people don't do this in modern statistics, right? Is because you can choose any test you want, you can set your numbers arbitrarily,
Well,
and get whatever you want.
And what they did in the radiocarbon work was that they when they did their reporting, they took their results, the statistical tests, and for the three control samples, they rounded the test down. So if it was like 62%, they rounded it and reported it as 60. I don't remember the exact, maybe 30. For the shroud, they rounded it up. So they went from 4.2 to 5. And they said, oh, we've got statistical significance that basically.
But, I mean, they could just change the alpha value, right? They could, like, who cares when it comes to this kind of statistical significance?
Why did they do that? And then when people went back and looked more carefully, it was even tighter than that.
I don't know, but I think it's
why did it take a lawsuit to get the British Museum to release that data?
What I don't know, but I think what I don't know is that some like atheist maliciously manipulated it because they were so scared of the power of this evidence. But going off of what we do know though, right, that doesn't undermine the evidence that we do have, and we can apply modern tools such as credible intervals to say, and James said that, or we could have an expanded confidence interval. We can just reapply our tests and we can get significant values.
Yeah, that's
Like
what some of the later papers did, that they applied as techniques that that incorporated the heterogeneity of the samples and expanded the confidence interval. But that's what I said initially. You can expand the confidence interval, which is appropriate given that there seems to be discrepancies in the techniques used in the labs. But what you don't get is a confidence interval that overlaps with the first century AD. It's not even remotely close to that. And there's something else that a bit confuses me. I think I'll direct this to Tom because he was making remarks about this. If Robert's hypothesis is correct, the carbon dating is accurate. It correctly in the sense that it correctly describes the amount of carbon-12 and carbon-14 ratio that's in the samples. Now, the assumption that there was no additional production of neutrons obviously is what skews it off according to Robert's sample. But here's what I don't think you can do. I don't think you can simultaneously say there was all of these problems with the carbon dating and also say that Robert's hypothesis accounts for the carbon dating, because Robert's hypothesis accounting for the carbon dating is based on the idea that the carbon dating is accurate based on the actual carbon-12 to carbon-14 ratio in the sample. You have to pick one of those, it seems to me.
What I'm saying is that when they reported those results and they had a huge effect, they really weren't honest with their statistics.
Sure, but
yes, we acknowledge that they did not use the appropriate statistical methods given the heterogeneity in the samples. Subsequent reanalyses have applied that. They expanded the confidence interval. The confidence interval goes nowhere close to overlapping with AD1. So the carbon dating still provides very strong evidence in favor of a late medieval date.
I'm not saying that those dates are not medieval. I think Bob's theory is very interesting, and it does make predictions that I happen to have seen with the fluorescence intensity.
We can talk about that, but we can't keep changing topics. We were talking about the carbon dating, not the fluorescence.
But what are you saying then? Are you saying that you accept the carbon dating or you don't accept it?
I think the carbon dating, the numbers were correct, but I don't think that the shroud was medieval.
Sure. And that's what Rob says, yeah.
But then, so are you just making the point that they were some bad guys who did this?
I think that they kind of fudged some of the stuff that they did. Again, why would it take 17 years in a lawsuit to get the raw data released?
Well, I mean, there's been a methodological crisis in social sciences, but it's extended into all the sciences, right? Where it's turned out that systematically across many disciplines, people have been data dredging, p-hacking, doing all sorts of bad practices to get values that they want. So I don't think it's surprising that we would pick a paper at random. I mean, I've seen some people doing meta-science reviews on this, saying that upwards of 80% of papers are actually fall foul at these kind of abuses of statistical tools. So it would be,
So let me. I think this will be helpful for the audience. So this will be the last sort of thing on the carbon-14 specifically. I know we've gotten into image formation, but on the carbon-14. So look. As far as we know, there are at least two known hypotheses to explain the carbon-14 data. There's Bob Rucker and Tom McAvoy suggest the neutron irradiation hypothesis. On the other hand, there is a natural one on offer that one of you guys mentioned from Brian Walsh and Larry Schwalbe, right? That one of the labs used a different cleaning technique, and this could explain why we have this heterogeneous data. So first of all, from Tom and Bob, what would you present as this is positive evidence that pushes us over the line, that it's probably, just sort of list out what they are, that you think goes, yes, this is probably not a medieval, it was probably neutron irradiated, and it's not due to the cleaning procedures. And then we can focus in on discussing those things. So yeah, Bob, I'll start with you if you're hearing us. What are the factors that you think push us over and say, yes, it's probably neutron irradiated?
Yes. When you're talking about this, you have to get into a consideration of the control standards that were run. There were 3 different control standards that were also run, and that they were then dated using the same methods as used for dating the samples from the shroud. And that there were measurements made by Tucson, Zurich, and Oxford. And so all 3 laboratories dated those control standards consistently and essentially correctly. And so therefore, the normal implication of that is that the measurements were done correctly on the Shroud of Turin samples. So I believe that based on that the ratios of the carbon-14 to carbon-12 in those samples were correctly measured. Now, the question arises, is carbon dating correct or is it not correct? Well, yes and no. It is correct in the sense that the ratios were correctly measured, but it's not correct in the sense that the equation that was used to calculate the dates from the ratios did not apply.
Would you say you would
That's
say
what I'm saying.
that you reject that the calibration curve that is typically used is appropriate in this case because you have a different model that would have a different calibration curve?
No,
No, I
no,
was saying
not
there
at
was
all.
an addition of neutrons.
Well, that's what I'm saying is that there would be a different curve, right, for how something that was treated with neutrons in this way would change its
Oh,
ratio over time
well, no,
than what would
no.
happen in the case of just organic matter that was depositing.
Okay, let me back up.
Okay.
I may appear like I'm not answering you directly, but I'm often trying to answer your underlying assumptions. Okay.
Okay. You could just
I'm
state
trying to
that. Yeah,
get
I'd be
through.
happy.
I'm trying to get through to you to correct some of your underlying assumptions.
Could you say what the assumption is that maybe and why it's wrong?
Okay, let me just work on what I can answer.
Well, you just said you were answering my underlying assumptions, so I would like you to just state that and why it's wrong. But if that's not what you're doing, then maybe you shouldn't say, I am correcting your underlying assumptions because you can't say anything about
I'm
it.
saying often that's the case. I'm trying. You said that I'm not answering you directly, and because that was because I was trying to answer some of your underlying assumptions.
But which are they
those,
then? Like, just say them
that,
maybe rather than referring to them.
I don't even remember what they were at this point.
Okay. Because in this case, what I'm trying to get at is, I mean, I think I want to make sure I've understood what you're saying, right? And I think that tell me if this is right or wrong. I think that you've said you don't dispute the measurements of the ratios of carbon in the item. You think that we can.
That's correct.
But what you dispute is whether in the ordinary case there is an assumption about a process that's taking place that changes those ratios over time in organic matter, right? So that
Yes.
and that's what we use in order to place something back across a period of time. And you're saying those assumptions don't hold, so we can't think about it in this case. Is that right?
The equations that are used to calculate a date from the ratio make an assumption that the ratios only change due to decay of the carbon-14. If carbon-14 is added or subtracted from any other source, then those equations don't apply. And that's what I'm saying. The equations that were used to calculate the dates from the ratios did not apply. And that's confirmed by 4 peer-reviewed journals, papers, that concluded that the samples were heterogeneous, as though they're not even related to one another. Now, another way to say that is that there was a systematic measurement error that was going on. And so what I'm saying is that systematic measurement error was due to neutron absorption, creating new carbon-14 on the cloth.
And how would you compare that to different treatment of the materials between the labs?
That should be experimentally determined.
Right. So, like you are aware of those differences that, for example, the Oxford lab has reported on.
Yes, but I will also respond to that in spite of the fact that different methods were being used to some extent, and that would be normal, that you still have to assume that the measurements were done correctly because they correctly measured the control standards. That's why the control standards are run.
Can I share something about that, the control standards? I did share this before, but I think it's sort of relevant here because, sorry, let me just pull this up.
Well, the Oxford ones are actually below the others, right, in those controls as well.
Well, one of the controls. So, but this is what I was. Hang on, let me just turn this off. This is what I was going to talk about because, so here we have the shroud dates, and you see that the Oxford one is, hang on, which way does this go? Younger than. Was it older? I always get this carbon dating confused. Yeah, older. Sorry, the Oxford one is older than the Arizona one. You see the intervals don't actually overlap between these two. The intervals overlap for the Cleopatra linen and the Nubian one. But the interesting point is that when you look at the other medieval cloak, which is thought to date to the similar age of the shroud, you also see this discrepancy between the Oxford, but this time the Zurich dates. And so the hypothesis would be that the cleaning techniques, now you would assume that they use the same cleaning methods for all 4 samples. As far as I know, that would be the normal approach. However, the effects of the cleaning processes could be different on the different samples depending on the history that they'd had, their exposure, their environments, temperatures, and all sorts of other things. And so it seems that we do have precedent here that there was a difference, at least for one of the other samples, between Oxford and Zurich. And the hypothesis would be that there was just a greater difference in the case of the shroud, potentially because it's been handled a lot more, say, than most of the others. So I'm not sure that we can explain exactly why we see greater discrepancies for some of those samples than others. But at least it seems consistent with what we see there to me, that we can explain the difference based on different effects of cleaning procedures. And there is a difference in one of the control samples.
And so we have to compare the reasonableness of that assumption, right? You can say that may not usually happen, but what we're comparing it against is that a resurrection did this to the samples, right? That a radioactive resurrection. And so this is where, again, the prior reasonableness is important to our evaluation of comparing these hypotheses to each other and can't be ignored.
Okay. Okay. Well, Bob, yeah, I'll let you respond, but I just wanted to say, so the control samples are one of your reasons for saying, no, I don't think the change in the procedure is accounting for it, and probably therefore neutron irradiation. Do you have others? James gave his sort of counter to that, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, on the control samples, if we look at how Oxford did their measurements, their results, compared to Zurich and Tucson, what I find here is that in the years, the difference in the years, the Oxford versus the others, Tucson and Zurich, was an average of 23.3 higher. And we're dealing in years before present, 23 years higher. But in the actual measurement of the shroud, it was 89 years higher. So if we just take into account the difference in the ability to measure the control standards, that only would give us about 25% of the difference between Oxford and Zurich Tucson in measuring the shroud. So even if we take that into account, it doesn't get us all the way there. It only gets us about 1/4 of the way there.
Wait, sorry, why is that? Like in terms of the actual process, that the
dispersion of dates is greater for the shroud than the controls. I just showed that on the diagram. The question is, what's the best explanation for that? I don't know exactly. I would speculate that the effect of cleaning is going to differ depending on the history and the handling and conditions of the sample. And we know that the shroud is atypical in that respect. It's been handled a lot more than any of these other samples likely have been, and in many different conditions. So I think that it's not implausible to think that the effects of cleaning are more variable on the shroud. Now, that is a hypothesis that's true, but I just think that that's far more reasonable than postulating a wholly new physical mechanism that's hitherto unprecedented. That's why I think that the differential cleaning is a better explanation.
Okay. All right. And Tom, I want to get just sort of list them off. Do you think what are the factors that you think make it the neutron radiation hypothesis more probable relative to the changing cleaning procedures? Do you have anything else other than the control samples, or?
Well, what I liked was when I looked at the fluorescent spectra, I saw the same trends that Bob saw. I mean, and at that time, nobody had really published anything on the fact that neutron radiation would affect fluorescence in linen. I looked around, I couldn't find anything, so I decided to do some experiments myself, and sure enough, it has a definite effect. So to me, that was the one thing in his work that I found impressive, and I was able to show that, yeah, it does have the same characteristics that he found in his simulation.
Okay, perfect. And let me turn to the skeptic. So same question to you guys. Do you think there is any evidence that makes it more probable that there is some change in the cleaning procedure is responsible for the carbon-14 data. It's not neutron radiation or something else. It's probably this. Do you guys have any evidential factors there?
I would just say I think it's an assumption, right, that there is a difference in this sample, and that is why the appraisal of the relevant priors is completely relevant to evaluating how the theories compare. They both explain the data, so the question just falls down to how reasonable are they before the data.
Okay, and
So
James.
I just want to respond to Tom's point because he's mentioned the UV spectrum a number of times, and I don't think we've said much about that. I'll confess I don't have a whole lot to say other than I did read Tom your paper, and what I was struck with was that I don't know how to assess the evidence you present because I don't know what other mechanisms could account for fluorescent properties of old linen. We know that it's true when you expose them to neutron radiation that can cause the fluorescence pattern, but I don't know what else did, what else potentially could, and that's what I'd really want to know in order to sort of differentiate between different hypotheses. Another concern I have about Tom's work is that he was working with photographs of the shroud, and I don't know enough about the exact processing procedures that was done. I know you had to normalize the illuminants and things like that. I'm not an expert enough to say how much that could potentially bias the results, but I am concerned about working from photographs rather than working from the actual sample. So those are just two thoughts there, but I'll acknowledge I don't have enough expertise to say there, but I feel like there's a lack of context to interpret these results.
Yeah, and I think in terms of theory comparison here, it's like, there are some, again, quite simple questions that can be asked. Like, maybe, for example, there's like a medieval ink called iron gall ink. Would that produce fluorescence differences to a material it was applied to? Does that absorb UV light?
And what do they do? Apply that to the whole shroud?
What we can talk about just could the question just be answered before the apologetic begins?
I don't know if that exists. I Somebody had asked earlier, what is it that makes you believe in the shroud? And uh, maybe you had Nathan mentioned that there was this market for these relics back in the medieval times, and somebody may have made this the shroud for that. Why in God's name would anybody make an image that was so faint?
I think
Uh,
that this is a really good historical question that basically I think there's a little bit of anachronism when we think about medieval times to think of people being so motivated by markets and profit incentives as we might be today. And you can put into that, like I think a very good historical analysis would engage with the fact that the person probably was a religious believer and may have actually thought that it was a perfectly legitimate thing to do to create an object of veneration. I mean, there's a tradition of creating icons in many religious traditions and of even creating, like the Catholic Church was well aware of many fake icons and
sure.
still legitimated the process of their creation as objects of veneration. It wasn't this dichotomy between it's a real or a fake. And so I think that that creates conditions within which there's clear motivations where someone, as an act of worship, would create an artifact that they would want to be as realistic as possible, so they could venerate it.
And why would they create a photographic negative when the positive you could really barely see? Also, if they were using human blood on it, which we know it was human blood, back then, it's the same as now. If you kill somebody, you're going to be in trouble. And also, I don't have all the details at my fingertips, but I believe when the shroud is put on somebody or was put on somebody, that the way the blood coagulates is going to be different than if you simply take it from somebody, bring it over to the shroud, and put it on.
Well,
Uh,
think I could potentially answer that. I mean, one response to give might be because, God divinely revealed to them the photo negative process and they just decided to. And I think that's ridiculous, but I think that still fares better than the assumptions that go into.
Yes, it could have actually been a divinely inspired medieval production. And I think that that's a hypothesis we should take just as seriously as the neutron hypothesis. And this is sort of what Nathan and I were trying to talk about before about assessing plausibility. Sorry to interrupt, Nathan, but I think that was a really good point.
It's okay. But then to get into like what I think are actually kind of like plausible candidates for this, it's either going to be in the application procedure, or it may even be in some kind of chemical being applied and then removed over time, and it's like a kind of weathering effect into the material. I mean, again, it's not something I've looked into to a great degree of depth, but there's many avenues you can go down in both of those directions, and none of which require making these assumptions about, resurrection and radiation.
So the people that did this, then they actually went to Jerusalem. They got some soil from Jerusalem because there is very unique limestone.
No, probably not them.
On the shroud that
I've got the
people
question.
found. Why would they make something that has 3D properties?
We're jumping around all over the place.
So the first question about why there would be materials deposited from different places. I don't know if you want to pull up the document and show all of the different pollens and things and soils that there are. There's a map in the document somewhere, but there are pollen soils and genetic materials from all over the world, including from whales in the Atlantic Ocean, right? So, how did all that get there? It's because this stuff is carried on the wind. There's a lot of people going on pilgrimage to get to these places. There's commerce taking place, and people are it's very kind of mundane explanations. Basically, any artifact that's had this kind of exposure has similar distributions of all these kinds of things.
I just had a couple of other follow-ups.
Basically, I think when you take that position, you can explain almost anything. So,
can I just make a few responses, Nathan? That's right. So first of all, I think that if you're willing to invent entirely unprecedented new physical processes like neutron radiation, you can explain everything. That's not what Nathan and I are doing. We're actually applying standard techniques in history and in the processes of trying to replicate things and look at the like carbon dating, for example. That's a standard technique. So we're the ones looking at standard techniques more so than inventing novel ones. But I wanted to respond to some of the earlier things that were said. So first of all, the idea that the shroud is the image on the shroud is too faint to be plausible as that it's too faint such that no one would have deliberately made it that way. One point is that we don't know how faint it was when it was initially produced. It's just an assumption if we assume that it looked exactly like what it does now. A second point to make is that it's possible that whoever made it thought that it should look that way, and that would be more credible. But also Nathan showed an image from the 17th century of the shroud being held up to a huge crowd of people. We know that, and they wouldn't do that unless you could at least somewhat see it. Like, I think it's a bit silly to say that it was so unimpressive that no one would have made it this way. Clearly, people have been impressed with it for centuries. So I don't think that's a very convincing argument.
And
as to the pollens and DNAs,
just on that one point as well, historians who commentate on that also seem to think that it's very likely that it would have been touched up and repainted for various presentations, including with blood, so it would be like extra red on the wounds for veneration, things like that.
There's been absolutely no blood found on the shroud. Sturp testified to that unequivocally.
Well, you'll have to take that up with your
in terms of
colleague.
people being interested in the image. It was certainly of much interest after the photograph was taken.
I didn't say paint. Yeah, sorry.
In 1890,
there's red ochre, So,
there's essentially no paint on the shroud.
Yeah, that doesn't mean there never was. But anyway, I didn't want to get too distracted on that point. We all agree that the image is not formed through application of pigment. It's formed through discoloration of the cellulose fibers. But the meta point that I wanted to make about this is that this is something that Nathan and I raised very early in this discussion. We asked, why would God produce a miracle through this means, particularly through this sort of strange process of producing the neutrons that distort the date, and then some slightly different but maybe connected process, maybe we can clarify, to produce the image. And both Tom and Robert expressed skepticism that this is even the right approach, that we can't say what God would do, you can't give a prior to that. So I think that it's a bit inconsistent to now demand that Nathan and I answer all of these questions about the motives and intentions of the hypothesized creator of the shroud. Why is it seems inapplicable to me to demand answers to intentions and purposes when it comes to a person, a human being. But when it comes to God, somehow we don't have to answer these questions. It seems like if you approach that, you're always going to arrive at the situation where supernatural explanations are preferred, because you never have to assess the plausibility. But whenever you say something is done through naturalistic means, now somehow all of these questions must be answered. And that seems to me just a very clear, inconsistent standard. I think that if one side has to answer those questions, the other side does. If one side doesn't have to answer those sorts of questions, then the other side likewise shouldn't have to answer them.
Fair enough. So, okay. So I think, yeah, we've transitioned to image formation. I think,
Sorry, Dale.
no problem. That's fine. I tried to get certain answers, but that's okay. So with image formation, I think the first place to start, let's try and clarify, look, what are the features that need to be duplicated? Do we agree on all of them or not, kind of thing. So yeah, like I'll start with the skeptics this time because I always start with the Christians. But James and Nathan, you guys go for Luigi Garlashelli as, something like that as the best. And the good thing about Garlashelli is he acknowledges most, if not all, of the same features the Pro Shroud side does. So how would you guys summarize what is essential if we're going to duplicate the Shroud images? What is it that's essential that we need to duplicate?
I guess the first thing I would want to point out is I do think that this line of questioning is a little bit of a red herring to the topic of like what best explains it and whether we can rationally infer like a miracle off of the base. But I would say the kind of coloration, right? So you've got the spatial properties. So you need something that is approximately the width and length of the thing, and something that can produce the kind of macroscopic appearance of the shade differences between different regions, right? You've got that. And then from what we know about the cellulose and the penetration of the cellulose, you want something that is going to be of a able to produce something of a similar depth. So if there's something that's going to like sear all the way through or something, that's going to be kind of ruled out. And any processes that would leave additional artifacts we don't find, we either need to introduce a reason that those artifacts are no longer there, or not go with that, go with other explanations that don't do that sort of thing. The other things I would add in are just some of the burns and the fold marks as well, which I mean, I think we probably all agree on what.
Well, yeah, I mean, those happened later anyway, but you need to consider that. But yeah, I would just to supplement what Nathan said, I think that the key things that, okay, first of all, I don't think it's necessary for a skeptic of the Shroud being a miraculous artifact to actually specify any mechanism by which it was produced, because I think it's perfectly reasonable to say this is an interesting historical artifact. We don't know how it was produced, and that's the case for many things, like the Antikythera mechanism, for example. I don't think many people think that was a miraculous object. There's many things we don't know about history, and so it's plausible just to say we don't know how it was produced. That doesn't mean that a miracle is a better explanation. That being said, in this particular case, I do think that we have plausible explanations of the general mechanism, and I think that the two key things that just need to be replicated are producing an image of the general macroscopic form of, the head and the arms and things like that of the body. So it looks sort of roughly like that. And of the, like, for example, an example of images that don't fit that would be the imprints that I showed of the dry and wet body, where you have like the face all distorted and things like that. That obviously doesn't fit the macroscopic properties. So it's got to fulfill that criteria. It's got to look like the type of image. The other key criteria is the microscopic factor. So it can't be applied through pigment, for example, that's still visible on the shroud. The image needs to be formed due to oxidative damage, which causes the yellow discoloration at a very superficial level of the cellulose fibers. And I think those are the really two key criteria. So because I think that the Garlashelli work does that very effectively, I regard that as a plausible hypothesis. I don't think that it's going to be exactly what was done in the Middle Ages, and it's also possible that the image we have now on the shroud is not exactly what it originally looked like. There may have been things that happened to it subsequently. Maybe there was initially pigment on that's subsequently worn off. Don't know, but I think that Garlashelli provides us with a plausible candidate, and I would personally require pretty strong evidence to say that anything beyond this sort of fairly mundane processes was at work.
Just to add into that as well, like some of the things that have been discussed about, say, fluorescence properties, right? We're not going to deny that those properties exist on the shroud. So ideally, we'd be also finding processes that would result in an image that's like that. So if there's no plausible connection, say, from a particular type of application of something to a process that would cause this damage that's then like, got these properties of fluorescence, well, then that would be a factor that would kind of screen off those kind of explanations as well.
All right, awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. All right, so now turning to Bob and Tom, do you guys concur? You heard sort of the features that the skeptics think are essential. They're necessary requirements for duplication. Do you guys concur with those, and or disagree? And do you have other ones that you would add?
Maybe I can go first here. My paper 34, I believe, is primarily on image formation. And what I developed was 27 different characteristics of the images. Now, any image formation hypothesis has to satisfy all 27 of those characteristics. And you can take every other hypothesis and disprove it using those 27 characteristics, except for what I've developed
Do it
in my
right
paper
now.
34.
Do it then. I don't believe it until you do it.
Just go to my website, shroudresearch.net, and go to paper 34. Or read the paper that was already sent to you. That's a good summary of it.
I just read it and it's wrong. And I've written up my answer on my website.
Nathan, I don't remember a list of 27. Maybe you could highlight a couple that are not those that we've mentioned so we could talk about them.
Well, the most difficult item for any hypothesis to satisfy is a requirement for the discoloration on a fiber to be less than about a micrometer all the way around the circumference of the fiber. That's the most difficult thing. That's the one that almost every other image formation hypothesis fails to satisfy. And if it doesn't satisfy that one item, it cannot be right.
So why do we have to have it exactly like it is on the shroud?
Because the shroud is the issue.
Yeah, but so that doesn't quite make sense to me. That's like saying that take this building over here. Unless you can reproduce exactly all of the measurements of this building, then we don't know how the building was constructed. What we need, in my opinion, is a plausible mechanism that can give the types of characteristics. It doesn't have to be precise down to, well, literally like the submolecular level in terms of like, not submolecular, sorry, the subcellular level at like the exact measurement. I don't understand why that's needed.
Okay, so we'll get into that. So cylindrical uniformity is something Bob says is necessary,
right.
And in his opinion, this falsifies everything you skeptics have got.
Everything else.
We'll discuss that then. But
okay.
Tom, just from you first, before we get into the discussion, is there anything that any features you feel are crucial that the skeptics missed and that are essential for reproducing the shroud and therefore can falsify a whole bunch of theories? Oh, you're muted, by the way.
Tom, you're muted.
There we go. I just made two quick notes. And one would be, if you looked in the Middle Ages and somebody painted or reproduced an image of Christ in the nude, they would be hung and quartered. I mean, that just did not happen. That is so unusual about the shroud. And the other thing that is unusual is if you look at the placement of the nails in the wrists, all the crucifixes back then, and even now, most of them have the nails going through the palms. And there are all sorts of these interesting features about the shroud that are unique to it. And so when I look at all of these things, and I haven't, studied this before this particular podcast, I just am amazed and convinced that the shroud is authentic. So,
Dale, you're muted.
Sorry about that. And just to clarify, Tom, so those aspects, would you say that those unique aspects have to be duplicated for the question of image formation, or are you more talking about the historical uniqueness?
Well, it'd be historical, but I mean, when you created the image, you would have to have these there. And I was looking a couple of weeks ago, and there was somebody that had several images of the way medieval artists drew Christ, And they were all completely different from the shroud in both of those regards. The fact that, he always had like a loincloth on and was not naked, and the nails would go through the palms of the hand. I mean, those are only two of, an innumerable number of properties about the shroud that I think make it unique.
Okay.
So I have some comments about those two, although we can talk about something else, Dale, if you think that's.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to see if there's controversy about those. Let's discuss the controversial issues, the cylindrical uniformity that Bob brought up, kind of
Sure,
thing.
that one I'm less familiar with, so it might be good to talk about that.
Sure, yeah, but yeah, go ahead and say what you want to say on these two that Tom brought up, and then we can go into because I assume you guys are going to say fine that we can replicate that.
Well, so yeah, I don't agree that so regarding the point about the shroud showing the nails through the wrist rather than the palms. Hang on, have I got that the wrong way around? So that the shroud shows.
Yeah, they would have been through the wrists, and the shroud, because of the distortion, looks like it's.
Yeah, so it said
it's
that,
arguably through the wrist.
Right, so that's a claim that it's through the wrist, which is different from the normal practice in the Middle Ages to show the nails through the palms. Yes, sorry, got muddled for a second there. So I don't agree with that, and I want to show why. I mean, I don't think that this will settle the point, but I just want to share what I think
though to be
about
fair, I do think given the evidence we have and some of the lines of rationality being applied, you would be perfectly warranted to say, sure, Romans typically did it through the wrists, but in the case of Jesus, they actually did it through the hands, because we seem to be allowed to make ad hoc modifications.
You could postulate that and to account for this, but so I'm just trying to. Okay, I just want to share something here.
Just out of curiosity, while you're bringing that up, do you think that if it is through the wrists, would that be impossible for a medieval artist, or do you guys think that a medieval artist could have done it that way as well?
Yeah, I think they could have. It would be unlikely that. I mean, that's the question, right? Is it impossible for someone to draw something going through the wrist? Like, no, that doesn't require someone to be causally connected to a miracle to do that. But it would be unlikely. I don't even know if I would say it's good evidence in favor of a real one, but yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, go ahead.
So
James.
this is just an example of an analysis that someone has done with this to try to illustrate the point. But I think I can also show this from the perspective of just the actual shroud itself. Sorry,
I'll just say that person, my best buddy, Hugh Ferry, the ultimate shroud skeptic.
Oh, really? Well, there you go. Didn't know that.
Yeah.
So this is the original image that we're looking at from the shroud. They've just sort of rotated that for comparison. When I look at this, the wrist is here. This is the palm. So I don't know why people consistently say that this shows the fingers on the image, which has been noted many before, are elongated. They're unnaturally long. So it's a little bit hard to get exactly the grasp of what goes where. But it seems clear to me that in fact is the wrist down here. What this shows is the blood dripping down across to extend across the wrist, but originating from the palm. So, it's sort of hard to see there, and I think that you can disagree about that. But to me, that the nail is not in the wrist; it's in the palm. So that's just how I see it.
In that case, the nail simply could not have supported Christ's weight on the cross. It would have torn out.
I think you're missing my point, Tom. I don't think this is the burial shroud of Jesus. I think that this is a production in the Middle Ages, which was produced by an artist who followed the convention of the time, depicting the nails in the palm.
And how did he make the picture?
Now you're changing the subject, which is what you always do when I try to respond to a point. You bring up a different point. You bring up pollen. You bring up DNA. You bring up something else. I'm responding to a specific point that you made about the location of the nails. And in my opinion, the shroud does not show the nail going through the wrist. It shows it in the palm. Now, we can dispute that because it's a bit fuzzy. I'll acknowledge that, but that's just my looking at it. And I mean, other people have said this as well. Now, the other point was about now I've forgotten. What was the other point that was mentioned?
By Todd, the nudity.
The nudity. Yeah, sorry, Nathan, did you want to
the loin? Well, I mean, I would say, firstly, I think that saying that a medieval depiction wouldn't include the loincloth would seem inconsistent with thinking the shroud was available during the medieval period and was understood to be a real item or even a relic, right? Because as long as it's around in circulation, people have that as an image that they're going to draw from to represent Christ in certain ways. I mean, we at least have people producing, like that piece of lead that I showed that shows Jesus with the loincloth, but there's many different depictions. I mean, in the paper that I was sharing, right? And the paper that I was sharing, I mean, Jesus has a loincloth, right? Here's something from that. Well, that's later, slightly later. Um, Here we have, he's got it's like, oh, is that a toga around him? Is it a loincloth? How exactly loincloth again? Look, like, in fact, I'm struggling. There's one where he doesn't, right? There you go. So we have a variety of images. I'm sharing the right thing, right? Just to, yeah,
Yeah.
cool. So I mean, we do have these medieval depictions that look like that. And in fact, what I actually consider this to be one of the sort of like strongest pieces of disconfirming evidence personally is, I mean, I give this paper a read, but the conclusion that she reaches is that
It's a
um
he.
it would
Andrea is a he, just saying.
oh he sorry yeah it would be appropriate to go through Bible dictionaries for blah blah blah. um Overlapping among medieval beliefs, erroneous archaeological identifications, and shroud-related conjectures from the 20th century. He doesn't think there's any good evidence to indicate that a scourging would look anything like what we see on the shroud, right? That now I've not seen anything that's that strong. We've got this appeal to a loincloth, but actually we can see that there are images where people wear loincloths. So like the question is, what else is there?
Yeah, and just to follow up, so the shroud, although it depicts Jesus as naked, does not actually expose his genitals, and this actually is interesting because
Unexpected.
yeah, it's pretty much impossible to actually for a male who's lying down to cover their genitals with their arms crossed across like that. And in order to get this to work, I think that Rob and I have both showed images of how it's supposed to work, and involves this sort of hunched figure with the legs propped up. It's quite an unnatural position for a corpse, and I think that this actually counts against the idea that this was a genuine burial shroud, because it's a very unnatural position for a body to assume. And it seems like the artist was consciously trying to ensure that the hands did cover the genitals, and does not really reflect the natural position for a dead body.
And the body could be in rigor mortis in that position, I guess you could say. But then, at least for the
You can
processes that are
you
going to
don't leave it
depend,
like that.
yeah, at least. But yeah, the point would be, even if you can add some assumption in that gets the body in that position, it's bound or so. I don't know. It's like you're still going to get differences then for these theories that do purport to be establishing a process that produces the image, where there would be surface area or volume that would be causing the image production to be different, right? Or it depends on what there's different processes proposed, right? But that would be something that you would expect to see in the image.
Okay.
I mean, like in one of them, right, the density around the torso was supposed to be causing a difference in the carbon 14, for example.
I know. So I'm neutral here, but I just want to ask the skeptics a quick question that before I go back to Bob and that, and we can discuss the cylindrical uniform.
Yeah.
But one thing with the anatomical inaccuracies, one thing that I've found interesting is that sure that's used by shroud skeptics to argue that it must be an artist, but I also think it can be used to support that it covered an actual human corpse as well, because there are certain obvious inaccuracies that no, even I could draw better than that. Like, for example, one of the thighs is literally a chicken leg compared to the other thigh. No medieval artist is that dumb, is that stupid, or
You want to see medieval cats, like medieval art is interesting.
true, but clearly this artist is trying to. Sorry, so it's not my place to argue.
No, don't worry. It's all right. I don't know, is my answer. I mean, I don't personally. I think what people often do, right, is take this photo negative and then kind of do a lot of projection looking into the void. I don't really think it's like photorealistic and detailed myself. I mean, it has some details, right? I'm not saying it's like completely cartoonish or something, but there being, I mean, like the hands are too stretched out, the proportions of things. I mean, why would this person? Is that inconsistent with the level of detail I see in other places? I don't really think so. I mean, there's just like proportions.
So there are a number of studies which have looked at the depictions of Jesus and the relationship with Gothic art, which was the time frame in which the shroud originates. In the historical record, I mean, like that's when it appears in the historical record, and that includes things like the gaunt depiction, depicting Jesus as like quite tall and spider-like, the very long fingers, as well as other things like the long hair, which is probably not what Jesus would have looked like. So I think that and so this incorporates things like having the arms different lengths in accordance with wanting to have the genitals covered. I think that this much better fits the idea that it's a product of the 14th-ish century, rather than that it is a genuine burial shroud from the 1st century. And I'm not sure why, like, even if you could argue, like, well, maybe an artist would do it differently, it's not clear how you would explain those the anatomical factors on the basis of it being Jesus's actual burial shroud. Those just seem very unexpected.
This is the problem, though, is that for the radiation hypothesis, you can, because you can arbitrarily produce any image.
Well, yeah, and that relates to the image
yeah.
formation hypothesis, which is why
Yeah.
I'm keen to learn more about it. Because, yeah, I mean, there could be distortions inherent in that process, maybe.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I do want to shift focus to this thing that Bob mentions, this cylindrical uniformity, because I do think that is something that would be essential. Assuming it's true and you guys accept this as a fact, this is something that speaks to the image mechanism and that sort of thing. So cylindrical, what it is basically just saying that the image color is on the superficial layer, but it's not just on the front. It goes all the way around each fiber, 360 degrees of superficial color. So that's the feature that Bob is mentioning here. So yeah.
And why does radiation do that, out of interest?
Bob, how does your theory account for this cylindrical superficiality as a feature then?
Yes, I had to think for several weeks on this topic because this has never been dealt with effectively by any other image formation hypothesis. So I had to think for weeks on this, and then it occurred to me that in my first year physics class at the University of Michigan, they taught us about the skin effect of an alternating current. Now, what that means is that when there's an electric current passing through a conductor, the electrons are going back and forth, and so that this creates and destroys oscillating electric and magnetic fields in and around the conductor, which force the electron flow to flow primarily in the outer radius of the conductor, exactly where the fibers are discolored. So I utilized that fact then to develop my image formation hypothesis that's in my paper 34, and then summarized in my paper that's going to be paper 44 that was distributed to you. So that what in my image formation hypothesis, what we had to get to was an alternating current in the fibers. And I had to do that by recognizing that along with neutrons being emitted, there were also protons emitted. And this would have been accomplished through the splitting of deuterium nuclei. So that there was also a oscillating corona discharge consistent with Giulio Fante. So there's some similarity here, many differences, but some similarity. So that this oscillating proton emission was oscillating between vertically up and vertically down directions, because that's how the nuclei in the body were oscillating. I know it gets complex, but this is what I had to do in order to arrive at a mechanism that was consistent with all 27 different image formation descriptions.
And Bob, just to clarify, because you Tom mentioned Giulio Fante's version of the corona discharge, are you saying that would also account for the 360-degree thing, or is it only your theory specifically?
Well, no, what I'm saying there is that Giulio Fante recognizes the existence of a corona discharge, and so do I.
Okay.
That's all. So that we're consistent in that sense. So that, yes, the main hypotheses that Shroud researchers have come to, that they believe that it has to be radiation from the body, and there's 4 different options for that. So mine is the last option here. It's the VCRB, vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis. So that's what we're talking about.
Good. And Tom, just before we get into the image mechanisms ability, do you have anything to say about the cylindrical uniformity aspect? You're muted as well.
I haven't really looked at that. It just amazes me at how shallow that image is on the shroud, on the threads on the shroud. It just, and that you can get when you actually take a photograph of it. You get such a high fidelity image from it, from the shroud itself. But no, I haven't studied that.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, well, so let me turn to the skeptics on this feature then. So, given any artistic mechanisms that you guys can think of, or and that sort of thing, do you guys think that those such mechanisms can account for this, or is this something it just can't?
So there's one methodological point I think it's important to make up front, which is that the exact same resources that were available in speculating about how a resurrection would produce this are available to anyone who takes an art hypothesis, where they can appeal to the same processes but caused by something that is non-resurrection. And then you compare, and if you're going to say, well, that seems very ad hoc and implausible, I mean, then you kind of get the objection right in the first place. So I mean, I think it would be open to us to appeal to some of these things and just like speculate about like either a random weather process or the fire being near stuff. And you could say, there's one of these paints like lead. Lead's a weak conductor. It created these sorts of effects. You just, give the right energy conditions happening. And I agree that if I was doing that and taking it seriously, you'd be like, what are you doing? That's like intellectually dishonest, right? And I completely agree with that, but I think that has to cut both ways when it comes to these other things. Like, why is it less implausible, say, that there's a fire with certain types of metals that create a current than that like a process we literally know nothing about other than that we can retrodict it from this one example happens. So, I mean, I don't have any specifics. Maybe have to think about it for a while, but it's not something that I think is insurmountable. Like I think I could probably come up with a handful of them in a fairly reasonable amount of time if I put my mind to it.
Okay,
Yeah, so
that's very interesting.
Rob said that it took him several weeks of thinking about this. So I would suspect that it might be good to get someone who's a textile expert and give them a few weeks to think about it and see what they can come up with. But I'll do my best as a non-textile expert to ask a few questions here. So one thing that's a bit unclear to me is that the point here is that there is discoloration around the entire outer circumference of a cellulose fiber. So my question here is, my hypothesis is that this discoloration is due to oxidative processes, not due to radiation. The question is, what type of distribution of discoloration or damage do oxidative processes result in? And I with respect to cellulose fibers, I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that it's quite contingent on the specifics of like the fabric and how it's treated and conditions and things like that. For example, I don't know the source of the information that the discoloration goes all the way around the fibers. I hadn't encountered this before, but for example, are these fibers that have been removed from the shroud, are they very superficial fibers? Like how have they been treated? It seems to me that the main issue is there access to the relevant parts of the cellulose fiber, like all around its circumference. As long as there's access for chemicals to perform the oxidative reaction, then you can have a discoloration all around the circumference. I mean, oxidative processes aren't going to happen inside the fiber because there's no access at the interface there. So oxidative processes are expected to happen at the interface. The only question is there anything preventing occluding the access to the inner parts of the fiber, like that face the shroud as opposed to face externally? And I'm not sure exactly about that, but it seems to me all you need to postulate is that the fibers for which this was observed have a sufficient accessibility at the interface between the cellulose fiber and surrounding areas that the oxidative damage is possible at the interface. So that's what I would speculate, and I would ask about what like research there's been done into comparing the like oxidative damage hypothesis to an alternate hypothesis.
Okay, so Bob, I'll let you get the last word on this, and then I'm gonna ask the Christians a question and give the skeptics the last word on their features. But with the cylindrical uniformity, you heard their sort of responses. Do you have anything to say? Do you think it is possible that maybe the oxidization process from some artistic means could have colored all the way around, or like what's your final take on that?
If any liquid is used to apply a material, maybe with a brush with maybe one fiber on it, etc., you would have capillarity of the liquid into the fiber because the fiber is just 1/5 the diameter of a human hair. There would be capillarity. But on the shroud, on the discoloration, there is no capillarity. Okay, so and it's only the top 2 or 3 layers of fibers on the thread that are discolored. If this was just due to, a passing caustic gas or something, you would be discoloring the outside of all the fibers. And so that's just not the case. It's not consistent with the shroud. That's not how the discoloration on the shroud fibers was created. So we have to get down to the fact that how in the world was the images formed on the shroud? That's the question.
So we know that the shroud's been subject to water damage. So this is what I don't understand what you mean by there's no capillary effects on the shroud. Like it's absorbed water before.
Yes, of course, but the discoloration
Yeah.
of the image shows no indication of capillarity.
Yeah, and so what that means is that the reaction was not facilitated by fluid that was soaked into the shroud. It was facilitated by an interaction, presumably with the atmosphere, because that's why it would be so superficial. Now, the question is, could that account for, would there be sufficient interaction with the atmosphere all the way around the cellulose fibers, or only on the parts of the fibers that are directly adjacent to the air? I don't know, and until I see some actual, investigation into that, I'm not just going to take your word for it, I'm afraid to say. I want to see actual investigation into how that process works with cellulose fibers.
So I don't even know what you're talking about here. Are you talking about a vapor in the air that's going through the fibers, or what? Are you talking about a liquid?
I'm talking about oxidative processes that are catalyzed presumably by the process that was used for forming the image, like Garla used, where he was able to replicate this. I don't know how exactly I don't think that was studied exactly how deeply the discoloration penetrated. That would be interesting to look at that. But of course, just because his doesn't replicate it precisely doesn't mean that some slight variation of his technique couldn't. All that you need is to explain how an oxidative process was superficial to only a few fibers, but covers around all of the fibers. That requires interface because for oxidation, you need access to oxygen. So it's not that surprising that it's superficial. It's presumably catalyzed by some agent that it's brought into contact with through the image production process, like Garla illustrated. So what I'm asking is simply, how do we know how superficial and what the exact points of contact are for those sort of oxidative processes? You don't seem to have any actual empirical evidence that an oxidative process can't result in what the shroud shows. You're just telling me that it can't. I'm not saying I know. I'm not a fiber expert, like a linen expert, but you're not giving me any reason to think that it has to be like it can't happen.
I've not done experiments on it.
But that's what we need to do in order to know this.
Okay, that's not what I'm doing. That's not.
But why are you so confident when there's no experimental evidence for this? You're just saying that it can't happen.
Don't you think you should care as much about trying to prove this hypothesis as you do about the ones that would confirm the hypothesis you like?
Garla, what mechanism did he use to oxidize the outer area of the fibers?
Would a good scientist want to find out if they were wrong?
I'm interested in it, yes.
I feel like you should already know the answer to this, to be honest, because you're telling me that it can't happen. Like you spent weeks thinking about this and you don't know about Garla methods. Like that kind of doesn't speak well to me.
I don't see how it can happen. If you have a vapor in the air just passing through, then you're going to be discoloring fibers. There's about 100 different fibers or more in a thread. I would think
you remember what James said?
He rubbed it with an acidic pigment and then put it in in an oven and then washed it to remove the pigment.
Can you remember what James said?
It was in a liquid form then, is that right?
Well, the acidic pigment was, yes, but the actual discoloration is not produced by the pigment being absorbed into the fibers. It's produced by oxidative processes, which are accelerated by putting it in the fire. You can look at his paper for more details than I can articulate.
I'd have to look at that closely, but once you're, so was it by pigment? It wasn't by pigment.
I just explained to you, there's an acidic pigment that's applied, but that's not what produces the image directly. It produces it indirectly through oxidizing certain parts of the superficial cellulose fibers. I don't know the exact measurements of how superficial it was. I don't know if that was taken. But you should know about this. You're telling us that this can't happen, and I'm telling you what someone's actually done this. I just think that this reflects very poorly that you haven't like looked into this to verify that this can't actually happen.
Okay, I've looked into his work before, and I was not, I didn't think it was correct. Okay?
Well, maybe not,
Sure,
right?
but why
But
is he
he's
not
only
correct
one
in this
guy.
case?
Okay.
But what
I
about
agree.
in this case? Like we can't. You can't just say I don't like the guy, so no, right? I mean, that's like a really bad, biased way of engaging with this. James has specified a process that seems like it
Yeah.
plausibly could explain the thing that you want it to explain. And in
Okay.
my opinion, you should like this. This is like something you're very interested in. You should be like, I want to experiment and test that. This could be the thing that explains the thing I care about, but alternatively, if you wanted to just preserve your conclusion and didn't care about what explains it, you'd be like, I don't care about all that. I'm just going to focus on what I already believe, you know?
Yeah,
I just
I
want to.
think what you have to do is take the fibers that this fellow had in his painting or whatever, and just measure them. Measure, how far they were discolored because of
Yeah.
the pigment that was put in. And I would be surprised if they weren't extremely superficial, but nobody's done that. So to just claim because he's able to get a picture, therefore he solved the shroud and
No.
blah,
I
blah,
won't.
blah.
I
James
won't have
said
this.
he
I
doesn't
won't
know.
have this. Robert is telling us that no oxidative process can do this. It's not on us to prove that an oxidative process can do this. I'm illustrating a case that I think is plausibly, but it's not on us to prove that it can. Robert needs to provide convincing evidence if he's to substantiate his claims that the oxidative processes cannot do this, because that's what he just claimed before. And so I won't have this reversal of the burden of proof. I'm saying I'm not convinced by the evidence that Robert's presented, which is essentially just trust me, bro. He hasn't experimented with this. He doesn't have citations. And there's even a case that might disconfirm it, might. He doesn't know much about it. And he's asking me questions about it. This is not convincing. Why would this convince anyone who doesn't already believe?
Now, first of all, I have not said that no oxidative process could
You did
do
say
this.
that. That's
No, I
you
didn't.
said nothing else can account for this.
I
You said
don't
only
believe-
your hypothesis can account for the 27, including this
I
specific one that we
believe
talked
that's
about.
true. I believe
Yes.
that's true.
Okay,
I
so you
believe
did say
that's
that.
true. But there could be an oxidative process that
Okay,
could do
there
this.
could be.
And you're saying some other of the 27 would.
In all of the image formation hypotheses that I have investigated, they've all failed to
So in
produce.
Garla Shelley's case, which one is it? Do you know? Well, you said you've not investigated.
Well,
it,
he
but
doesn't
could
know
you
about the
spec-
superficiality
Yeah.
aspect. Yeah.
Could you speculate in Garla Shelley's case? Could you specify in Garla Shelley's case
See,
which of the
I would
20
have to have more details on
Sure.
what he did and what the results were.
Do you have any like maybe there are acids might be quite a common approach.
Well, but Nathan, the thing is, we know that if he looked into it, he'd find differences between Gala Shelley and the Shroud. This is what we
I'm
talked
sure,
about before.
but
There's always differences. And so the thing is, if you don't have a clear standard of what is essential and what's not, you're always going to be able to find differences.
But this is why I don't like this list of 27, right? Because you keep referring to it, but it's important to actually say what the specifics are. We can't just trust that, it will be wrong if we don't know. Because what we should say, what it's responsible to say is, I don't know. You have to get comfortable saying, I don't know. That's what.
Well, he did say that. He did say that.
Yeah.
All right. So, and I just want to clarify for the audience, because when we started this, we were talking about the cylindrical superficiality or cylindrical uniformity, but you guys have been just talking about the straightforward sort of superficiality.
No,
Well,
I was talking about both aspects.
So what James is proposing, I mean, and he did make the caveat that it would be for the area that was sampled. I mean, so if you could take multiple samples, and there's issues.
Yeah,
with
I
that,
don't
of
know where
course.
these fibers were sourced from, so I need some
So maybe
details there
that
as well. But
so the point is that maybe that has something to do with it. If these fibers are more loose than in other places, that is something that should and could be explored. But maybe that isn't what explains it. I think what James is proposing, though, is that for those surface fibers, it reasonably could be the case that the acid penetrates and oxygen is able to get to all around, such that you get oxidative damage all around. And when we say it's only on those top layer of fibers, I mean, do we really mean that? Are there really no gaps? Is this like an airtight, because even if the radiation thing were true, presumably there'd be some tiny hole where a little bit got, so we need to be really clear about all of these parts, and I just don't think the work's been done.
If if you don't mind, like I'll come out of the host and I'll just say my knowledge. It's
You've
gonna
gone
be
a bit quiet, Dale, at least on my end.
sorry.
The volume's lower. Is that just me?
My volume's low.
Yeah.
Yeah, it went a bit low. I don't know if you moved away from your mic or towards it.
Hello.
It's okay. There it seems to be normal.
Okay,
So
I just leaned back, I guess. All right, but yeah, just to share knowledge kind of thing, and I'll be fair to both sides as the host. But so there have been experimental data. So Luigi Garlascelli didn't give us details. He didn't take measurements and that sort of thing specifically. So that's a flaw, and he didn't share his results so people could double check it. He did admit he had issues with thread level and fiber level superficiality. And there have been subsequent experiments. In fact, I mentioned in the peer reviewed paper. So I worked with Hugh Ferry and Giulio Fonte. I actually brought pro Shroud scientist and a Shroud skeptic together to test an experimental theory, and he uses Luigi Garlascelli, same sort of technique with minor modifications, and superficiality was an issue. They didn't achieve it.
could you get like when you say it was an issue, like what does that mean? Does that mean like all of the fibers X have this kind of damage? Does that mean it's two fibers rather than one? Like what, does that mean?
So with superficiality, so the shroud superficiality is 2 to 3 fibers thick on the per thread, right? So that's thread level. What Hugh Ferry's quantified results were, it was over 40 fibers thick, the color penetrated down. So that's what we found.
Has this been published? Because I haven't seen this work.
It's in a peer reviewed journal that you guys don't like, Heritage, but there's a
can you send a link just so I'll look later?
of course, yeah. There's a whole series.
But actually, 40 to 3 doesn't sound like that dramatic a difference to me, particularly when we're talking about centuries of wear and the possibility that they haven't quite got the technique down yet. So I guess it depends on how precise you think that it needs to be to count as a plausible explanation.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. All right. So Bob and Tom, outside of superficiality, this will be the last thing before we kind of wrap up on this.
I just really sorry to interrupt. I still don't really understand the postulated mechanism for image formation. I just like to understand that a bit better. Because I understand it somehow relates to protons, but I just don't quite see how that connects to the neutrons that shift the carbon date.
Okay.
So I just really like to understand that better because I don't get it.
Can you explain sort of the step by step? So you've explained in the past on my show that, okay, look, there's this supernatural event that happens in the first femtosecond, but then after that, the laws of physics take over. Step by step, you can give sort of the process. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the best thing to do would be to read the paper that was distributed to you, Hypothesis to Explain the Image Formation and Carbon Dating on the Shroud of Turin. That would give you a full explanation. Now,
but suppose we were talking to the author and he could
we're talking to the audience actually, so
yes.
They presumably haven't read the paper, so maybe you could help them and then I could provide some comments. Because I did read but did not fully understand what you're proposing.
Sure. So, what I'm saying here is that to understand image formation, you need to start on page 4, and then it goes up through page 12. So 4 to 12 would be the ones to read. And so that's all rather difficult to summarize to give a full understanding in just a couple sentences. And that's why I'm recommending that you read some of this that I've already written. But the basics.
Okay, so maybe. Oh, sorry. I thought you were. Go ahead.
But the basics is that a very small fraction of the deuterium nuclei, specifically 0.0004% of the deuterium nuclei split. With each deuterium nuclei that splits releases a neutron and a proton, and they are separate particles. The neutrons do not become protons. So it's the neutrons that shift the carbon date, and it's the protons that form the image. Now, the reason why I think that it was charged particles that formed the image was in order to utilize the skin effect of an alternating current. Now you can look that up on Wikipedia, skin effect of an alternating current.
Sorry, can I jump in there? Rob, the skin effect applies to conductors. Cellulose is not a conductor, so I don't quite understand how that's relevant.
Yes, that's one of the predictions of this, that under extreme conditions, it will conduct.
I see.
Okay? Just about anything will conduct under extreme conditions. Okay, so the protons, usually when we're talking about radiation hypotheses, the discoloration is formed by radiation damage. That is, that the radiation goes through the fiber and it dislodges electrons, thus causing damage of the molecules. So I'm saying that I don't think that's what happened. I think it's not radiation damage, but it's deposit of electrical charge that was deposited on the cloth in an oscillatory fashion, up, down, up, down. So it was going onto the top cloth and onto the bottom cloth. Now, with each alteration between the vertically up and vertically down directions, there was it would have created corona discharge, consistent with Giulio Fante's concept. So that what we end up with here is pulses of electron flow in the fibers, which was on again, off again in an oscillatory fashion.
Can you clarify for the image production of that process, that why would that not get any of the fibers underneath? Why would that only constrain itself to the very top layer of fibers?
Yes, that's always a good question, and that's part of the issue that has to be resolved. And I think the answer essentially is it has to be related to a detailed consideration of the electrical charge effects going on in the resurrection. There were multiple different evidences, not only of neutron absorption shifting the carbon date and protons forming the image, but also of electrostatic effects going on that we see on the shroud itself. So that it's only the fibers toward the body that are influencing this, because that's where the charge difference occurs. It's between the body and the top fibers on the cloth. It's because the protons would only penetrate to the top 1 or 2, 3 fibers. Also, these fibers would be twisted and wrapped around each other so that they would also be conducting somewhat during that time. So that the electrical effects would just primarily be between the top fibers of the cloth and the body.
And that kind of, would that'd be like a kind of burning on the fiber, right, on the outside, would it?
Well, yes, what it does is that when the electron flow, because of this oscillatory electric and magnetic fields, forces the electrons to the outer circumference of the fibers, that's where the electrons would then bump into the molecules of the fibers, causing them to move, which is heat. That's the definition of heat.
So it is a kind of like burning on the outside of the fiber from electricity.
It's deposition of heat.
Okay.
But that's not what the image is. The image is oxidative damage to the cellulose fibers.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly right. So the high temperature of that just very outer circular region causes it to be scorched. Now, we're familiar with a scorch, okay? So I'm saying that the discoloration on the fibers is due to a scorch effect from heat deposited electrically.
And do you know, does a scorch effect on this type of linen fade with time or anything as well?
No.
No, okay.
No, it shouldn't, no. Matter of fact, that was some of the experiments. They did multiple different experiments in the Shroud of Turin research project, STIR, where they tried to determine what chemicals affect this. And everything they tried failed to affect the discoloration until they finally arrived at one, diamite, which removed it immediately. And that's a chemical which changes a double carbon bond back to single carbon bonds. So that means that the discoloration on the fibers is due to the single electron bonds with the surrounding atoms in some way, somehow, being altered into some of these being double electron bonds. So in other words, it's not the addition of anything. It's based upon the atoms that were already in the fibers.
Yeah, so that's a chemical change.
Sorry, Jay, I just have a clarifying question, then you can come in. But Bob, I'm just kind of curious because I have heard that there's an issue, like a problem with the shroud, that the images over time, like pretty soon we're not going to be able to see them. I'm pretty sure somebody told you that.
Yes, that's true. That's true because of the darkening of the surrounding material.
Okay.
So the contrast is decreasing. So in the past, there's some evidence that things were visible previously that are not visible now, for example.
Gotcha.
And that's why they've, in 2002, they took the effort to put it into this stainless steel box with an inert atmosphere so that in order to reduce the oxidation of the surrounding material.
Gotcha. Perfect. Yeah. Sorry, James. Go ahead. I just wanted to clarify that.
No, that's fine. And that relates to a point that I mentioned before, that the image was probably more visible in the past. But so I understand. I'm not really sure about this proposed mechanism. It seems very novel and unsubstantiated to me. But I want to put that aside and just understand. This is the part that I really wanted to clarify. So far, we've proposed a mechanism for affecting chemical changes to the cloth on the basis of this oscillating currents, which induce this skin effect and then heat the surrounding material, which scorches it and produces the superficial damage. But that is a mechanism for altering the cloth. What we need in addition to get an image is that process to occur differentially such that it imparts effectively information about allegedly the body that was underneath it, or like whatever it is that formed that. So like, for example, a thing that I mentioned before, we see a dark pattern which apparently indicates Jesus's hair, and then a sort of a light pattern in between, I guess, his hair and his cheeks, and then like there's slight lightening around the orbits, and then like darker in the middle. You know what I mean? Like that's the contours that give us the shape. How is that produced as a result of this electrical oscillation process? Because it would seem that this process would be dependent entirely on the mass of material underneath any given point, and not like, so why would the hair produce a darkening, for example?
Yes, I think you're correct in saying that we have to take into account information. That's an absolute necessity, because every image you see you open your eyes, you look around you, you look at a photograph, a magazine, a computer monitor, cell phone, whatever. Every image you see is due to information that's being transferred to your eyes in reflected photons. So the reflected photons in their frequency are communicating color. In their intensity, that is the number of photons, they're communicating shade, light versus dark. And the angle at which those photons are going through the lens of your eye, that determines the point on the image that has that particular color and shade. So information is the crucial element. And I recognize that, and I don't think some are trying to take that into account now. But until my work on this, other image formation hypotheses did not take into account information. And that's a crucial account, because we can see the image on the Shroud of Turin because the information that defines a crucified body has been encoded into the pattern of discolored fibers on the shroud. And that information is transferred to our eyes in reflected photons, which are absorbed into the rods and cones at the back of our eyes. That information is translated into electrical signals transferred up our optic nerve to our brain, and our brain has learned to recognize those electrical signals as the image of a crucified man. So that's basically what's going on. But the question
I'm a behaviorist. James and I disagree on this. So
we're not going to get into that, Nathan.
People
I know you wouldn't
do
like that talk of information.
The brain is causally involved.
But the question is not how our brains form the image, like when we look at it. The question is, how was the patterns of discoloration formed? And this is what I don't understand about the electrical oscillating currents. Is it seems to me that the density of the discoloration would be proportional to the amount of material that was underneath or in the vicinity of that part of the body. But that isn't what we see here. For example, this is why I mentioned the hair as a good example, because the hair has very little mass and yet it's dark. But then there's this light region in between the cheeks. And likewise, there's parts around the center of the mass here, like just above the hands, that are lighter than the fingers, or maybe the surrounding torso would be a better example, when it's just not clear why you would see that difference. Or here's the arm, which actually has more tissue because it's an arm on top of the torso, but it's lighter. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't quite see how the patterns of densities on the shroud matches to the density of material that's allegedly emitting the neutrons and protons in the first place.
Yes. So let me try and I was getting to that.
Okay, yeah, sure.
A lot of these issues, I try and lay a foundation so that you have better understanding of where I was going. So it's a wrong assumption to assume that there would be more radiation coming from a larger mass. Rather, it's related to the surface, the total surface, and hair has a large surface area. Okay.
So how do we know it's related to the surface and not the mass? Because I thought it was the same amount of radiation emitted per unit mass. Isn't that how you modeled it in your simulation? It was based on the mass of the body, not the surface area?
Now you're confusing MC&P calculations with image formation.
So these are totally separate hypotheses. Is that correct to say that they're totally different from each other?
Yes, totally different.
Okay, yeah. So they're separately, because I was getting the indication before that there was some connection between them, but you're saying that they're totally separated.
Okay.
Okay, that's fine.
These would have to be inconsistent with each other, or they would just be.
Well, they're happening at the same time.
But would they not interact with each other then, if they were?
I'm just trying to think. Would they interact with each other? No, I don't. I can't think of a way in which they'd interact with each other.
Okay.
Because the mechanism of what they're doing is so totally different. One is shifting the carbon date based upon creation of new carbon-14 atoms, and the other is causing a discoloration on the fibers by depositing heat. So the mechanisms are so very different. So they're not related to each other.
Okay, so you're saying the image forming radiation is emitted based on the surface area, not the volume. Okay,
yeah,
but that still doesn't seem to fit the image, because then we would expect, say, the mustache and the beard and the hair to be much darker than everything else.
Yes. Okay. The other thing. Now, let me just explain to you why this is more of a surface effect than a mass effect. Okay, and it's in the difference between a neutron and a proton. A neutron has no electric charge. It's neutral. So therefore, as it interacts with the surrounding matter, it is not interacting with the electrons. All it does is it bounces off the nucleus. That's all it does. And so a typical neutron will bounce maybe scattering events, maybe 100 different scattering events before getting out of the body. But it gets out of the body. So you have maybe 98% of the neutrons getting out of the body, and then they're
all in lines, right? They're not interacting with each other at all in this view as well.
Well, neutrons are going in all different directions, because each scattering event in the body gives it a brand new direction.
Okay, would that
because it's scattering off of hydrogen?
Well, what I'm thinking in that case though is if they're going off in different directions and they're hitting each other, would that produce what we see, or would we expect like weird patterns that do different things to what we see then?
Well, it's just that protons and neutrons are reacting so basically different. Now, protons, of course, are charged, so that they interact with the electrons, so that we have a much smaller fraction getting out of the body. Maybe it's, depending on the energy that we're talking about, anywhere between 1 in 10,000 protons to maybe 1% of the protons getting out of the body. So that when you have that going on, it becomes a surface effect.
And like, in your view, is there a reason like why this is happening? Like, why is deuterium splitting?
Well, yes. The root cause of this was actually determined by consideration of the image formation hypothesis. So I reasoned back 12 different logical cause and effect relationships to arrive at the root cause, which I hypothesized as being a vertical oscillation of the nuclei in the body. Now
And
that was
what? Yeah.
totally that was totally new. I didn't expect that. I didn't invent that out of free, nothing. I arrived at it logically by
Yeah,
that
I get it
logical
follows.
sequence in
I get that
paper
it follows the
34.
chain back, but like
Yeah,
what I'm wondering is like somewhere here, right? For example, that isn't happening in my body right now.
no.
Like, why is it happening there and then?
Okay. So the root cause was a vertical oscillation of the nuclei in the body. That is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. If you like to talk in terms of miracles or miraculous or supernatural, that's where you'd apply it. Well, I don't like to talk in those terms because anytime you start talking in those terms, you never define the terms. Well, that's no good. When you're dealing with science, you have to deal with precision of definitions. So I don't talk in those terms. I merely say that that is an event that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. Now, it's also interesting that the Bible presents Jesus' resurrection as merely the first occurrence of everyone who will be resurrected. So often you think a miracle is a one-off event. Well, in that sense, Jesus' resurrection is not a miracle. It's only the first occurrence of everyone being resurrected
Does
for
this not
judgment.
become a problem for Christians who get cremated though, or whose bodies have
No,
decomposed? What?
no,
Why not? Yeah.
because it's based on information. How is the human body going to be reformed in the resurrection? It's all based on information.
Well, I mean, you could. I mean, sure, like I agree that you could describe the entire process of entropy and it'll all be
Yeah.
conserved and everything, but um, I guess why is it different in different cases? Like why? So like for example, how does that make sense then theologically with the idea that all of creation is in some way restored if there's a finite amount of matter that's say shared between all things, some of which is going to become people, so then there's going to be a bunch of stuff like destroyed that's made of matter that once was people. It gets very it is very strange to me.
So
Well,
I'll let Bob, I'll let you give your answer to that, but I do want, I don't want, I want to hear an answer to James's initial
Yeah,
question
yeah,
about like the mustache being lighter than it should be if it's based
yeah,
on
sure.
surface area. Because I don't think we got an answer to that, and I think that's important. So
yes, the other thing going on here is that the discoloration on the body is a function of the distance between the body and the cloth. If you can imagine that. And that's why it's a negative image on the cloth, and that's what creates the three-dimensional effects or topographical effects on the cloth. It's related to the distance between the body and the cloth. Now, let me go into this a little bit more, onto the electrostatic effects that we see on the Shroud of Turin. Most people don't get into this. The top cloth, where the front image is now located, the top cloth was not on the body. It was elevated above the body due to electrostatic effects. The body was not on the back cloth. It was elevated above the back cloth due to electrostatic effects. And I arrive at that conclusion by following the evidence where it leads. That's what I'm doing.
But
Following the evidence where it leads.
Robert, surely if there was enough if there was enough of a charge effect to levitate the body above like the stone, that would result in huge electric discharges, which would like ignite the cloth. Like, wouldn't the energy transfers be enormous? Like the amount of charge you need to support a body like that is huge.
Well, you have to realize that there are four forces in nature: strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, electrostatic, and gravity. The electrostatic is orders of magnitude stronger than gravity. So it would be surprising to you how much, little the electrostatic effects has to be to compensate for gravity.
Have you calculated the amount of charge that would need to be present and what
No, I've not
discharges that would
calculated.
lead to be and what temperatures that
I've
would
not
result? Because I'm concerned that would burn all of the cloth. I don't know. I haven't done the numbers, but like that,
Yeah, I haven't
because
done
we don't normally see
numbers either.
levitating bodies due to electrostatic forces. And it seems to me plausible that that would result in very large discharges. And you know that we can get discharges due to big voltage differences, which can cause fires. So it doesn't seem that implausible that like you want to make sure that the math works out there, because you don't want to have it such that it would take such a huge charge imbalance that would result in electrical discharges that would burn the cloth, because then we wouldn't have a cloth.
Well, yes, we are talking about corona discharge, static discharges between the body and the cloth. So that, yes, that effect would be taking place. But
the temperatures have to remain low enough such that the cloth isn't noticeably singed, because we don't see that. So I haven't done the numbers, so I don't know, but I want to see that analysis, because intuitively it seems that there are going to be very large effects there if you're saying the whole body was levitated.
Yeah. So let's just go over the evidence for that. If you take a naked body, put it on,
might as well it's just the image, right? I mean, that's what we need to.
Yeah, if you take a normal human body and you put it on a piece of glass and take a photograph of it from below, what you see is a flattening of the buttocks and of the shoulders.
Yeah.
We don't see that on the shroud. So that's the evidence that I'm using for the fact that there are electrostatic effects that are elevating the cloth above the body. Now, if in further investigation that we find that that's not possible, then yes, I'll have to modify this concept. But on the front cloth, if the cloth were wrapped around the face, and the image of the face was due to contact, for example, then when you unwrap it, you'd end up with a face that was maybe twice as wide as a normal face, and we don't see that. So that indicates that the top cloth was above the body. So when we're talking about distance between the body and the cloth, you have to take those two items into account, that we have a situation where the top cloth was above the body and the body was above the bottom cloth, so that we can accurately communicate something to the cloth that was related to the distance between the body and the cloth, because the cloth in both cases would be constant.
Well, I think it's simpler to just hypothesize that the artist used a bas relief carving like Gallicelli did, rather than inventing all this new physics. But we've been over. Well,
I've got a question in this line, like for Robert. Then is there any point, sort of in this chain of inference, where you would think, like, no, I'm really stretching things here, I just don't know, and stop? Like, what I'm saying is, like, are you willing to make modifications forever in order to make the explanation work? Like, is there any point at which you would have introduced so much into your theory that you would go, clearly I'm being biased here, clearly, or would you never do that?
Well, in my paper 34, in consideration of 27 different evidences regarding the images on the shroud, if someone came along and did a thorough review of that paper, and I invite them to, and then they make recommendations for which assumptions at each step in the process, which assumptions they regarded as being unreasonable and suggest more reasonable explanations.
I'm not sure
consider that.
Well, so that doesn't really answer the question, though. So that's a scenario where someone else gives you reasons, right? But what I'm asking you, in terms of like your own kind of intellectual virtues and standards you hold yourself to, like, are you concerned about like motivated reasoning as a bias? Like, for example, I'm concerned about it with myself, where there are things that I believe, and if I caught myself, whenever I catch myself actually modifying something I believe, like James and I had some conversations about brains and language recently, and there are problems with some of my views that he's introduced me to. And whenever I catch myself making like a change to my views, I think, am I doing this for principled reasons, or am I being intellectually dishonest here and just doing that because I don't want to change my mind or something? And I'm wondering, is it the same for you? Is there like a point at which you would go, yeah, that is too far, I can't keep making changes forever?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is why I'm doing this work by issuing papers that are available to everyone on the internet. So that's part of the process of me learning. So as I learn more and going from paper 1 up to now paper 44, if you look back in some of the previous papers, yes, you can find some changes that I've recognized new information that I'm now correcting things in my more recent papers.
Suppose like from now, right, you introduced like 5 additional physical processes for different features in like 2 years' time. From where you are now, would you think that that would be too far for you? Like that you'd be stretching things a bit if you had to introduce 5 more different
Well,
independent physical processes?
if I were to discover that instead of 27, that there were actually 32 evidences, then I'd redo the paper, including all 32.
Oh, sorry, I'm saying the evidence stays the same, but you have to introduce 5 new assumptions in order to explain it. Just hypothetically, it's a fictional story. For your values, would that be too ad hoc?
Well, I don't know. I'd have to face that when I came to it, I guess.
What about 1 million? If you had to introduce 1 million assumptions, would that be too ad hoc?
Well, I don't think I could think of that many.
Well, like, I don't know, 10,000 then, right? 10,000
Yeah.
assumptions.
Yeah,
Is there any number at which it would be too
there
many
probably
assumptions?
is, but I don't know what that would be.
That's all right, but yeah, okay.
Fair enough. All right. So I think I wanted to give Tom, he's been sitting here patiently,
Yeah,
him the
sorry, Dale.
last word on the image formation issue kind of thing. So
Sure.
is there anything else about image formation that's really important that we missed, or do you guys
Oh,
think?
that's fine. Happy to finish up.
Okay. Tom, you will have to unmute yourself, but I'll give you, you've been sitting here patiently listening to all this. So
Yeah, I have not really studied the image and how it's formed, and I'm going to have to leave shortly. So I think we've covered the waterfront. So
okay.
I don't have anything further to offer.
All right. All right, cool. So yeah, I think at this point, yeah, we have been at it for at least 3 hours and stuff. So I just want to thank all of the guests for coming on and doing their research. Look, we didn't come together just for this show. James and Nathan wanted their papers. They wanted to do their research. And obviously Bob and Tom are experts, so they're well researched. So this was something that we prepared for before coming together. So I want to say thank you to all the guests for coming on and being willing to do that and put in the hard work to do this great show, getting into the substance of the image formation and the carbon dating and stuff like that. So I hope you guys all had a good time. There's a couple heated moments, but hopefully overall you guys enjoyed yourselves.
Thanks for having us, Dale. I appreciate
Yeah,
Tom and Rob for talking about their
yeah.
work and being
I
willing to.
appreciate everybody and have a nice holiday.
Absolutely. All right, cool. So yeah, that's it for today, guys. And yeah, next week, another Shroud show. I'm bringing on William West, who's going to be talking about his Shroud conference presentation and also a debate between modern atheism and Phil Bear on the resurrection. Actually, James, you were invited. You were supposed to be a part of that, but it kind of fell through. It's going to be a tag team, but yeah. So uh, tune into that on Saturday. And other than that, have a great week, everybody.
All right. Take care. Have a nice weekend.
Yeah, thanks.